proper porcupine defense in the Taiwanese style. Already, Estonian defense officials have indicated that they would consider a first strike against Russia if an invasion seemed to be imminent. On the home front, Estonia can train more of its listed reservists, put an armed and reasonably dangerous civilian behind every tree and along the banks of every river. It can organize them into local self-protection forces and empower those small forces to react as they see fit in a time of crisis. That way, if little green men really do attack, they'll need to account for a national resistance operating unpredictably and playing by their own rules while defending their homes and families. Estonia already does have local programs that get part of the way there, training civilians to take part in national defense. But the nation can do more, and it's got to act fast. And NATO, as usual, can get on its fucking arse and address the problem that it can already see coming. The prospect that Russia could fully or partially invade Estonia in a challenge to the alliance has been a publicly acknowledged possibility since the 60s, before modern Russia was even Russia. NATO knows about this possibility, and while in 2022 it stationed about 2,200 troops on Estonian soil, it would be wise to rapidly increase those numbers as soon as possible. Not only that, but NATO can increase the size of its naval deployment in the Gulf of Finland and take advantage of Finnish, Swedish, and Latvian airfields to position much larger numbers of NATO combat aircraft. Finally, NATO's rhetoric can be genuinely useful if the alliance's leaders work to deliberately raise awareness of a potential Russian threat to Estonia and educate the global public about what a Russian provocation could look like, thus reducing Russia's plausible deniability when that's exactly what plays out on Estonian soil. But if NATO's going to engage in any of those proactive measures, then it has to act fast, because it doesn't appear that Russia is willing to wait. We've said it before on this channel, and we'll say it again, Russia's calculus has changed. No longer can Moscow be expected to finish its operations in Ukraine and reorient its forces before testing the NATO alliance. The NATO members of Europe will be deep into rearmament by 2027 or 2028. The Ukraine war might not even be wrapped up by then, and political changes in the United States may make America more likely to honor its NATO obligations in just a couple of years than seems likely for the US right now. The Russian economy is trembling. It can't be held together with band-aid solutions for much longer, and Vladimir Putin is getting older. Russia knows full well that if it's going to test NATO, that's got to happen soon, before NATO grows more powerful and Russia loses its strength. For Estonia, that means the time is now for the country and the NATO alliance to either square up and get ready for a fight, or decide that it's going to roll over. And if the NATO alliance simply chooses to roll over, then Estonia's fate is sealed. So let's hope that a wiser approach prevails. Thank you for watching.
Russia is the largest nation on planet Earth, spanning 11 time zones across 2 continents, sharing overland borders with 14 countries, and laying claim to 17 million square kilometers across forests, mountains, and freezing Arctic tundra. Its coastline stretches nearly as far as the circumference of the Earth. It dwarfs not 1, not 2, but 3 other continents, and it touches 3 oceans half a world apart. It's home to a quarter of the world's fresh water, and by surface area is the same size as the entire dwarf planet of Pluto. For a nation so vast as this one, a nation so mind-bogglingly big, it might seem as if all this space should be enough, right? Well, actually, no. Because no matter how long you pore over your map of the world staring at the gigantic Russian landmass, you're still going to miss a spot. Zoom out from Russia, head west towards Europe, and hone in on the Baltic Sea, where Finland and Sweden stretch down toward the Baltics and Poland. Look a little closer, and the 3 Baltic states will come into focus. But look closer than that, and between Lithuania and Poland, there's a little part of the map that doesn't have a label. Look closer, and closer, and closer, and you found Kaliningrad, a 223 square kilometer exclave that swears allegiance only to Moscow and to the same ruler that commands the rest of Russia's great expanse. So, today on Places, we're going to try and figure out this little geographic anomaly, why it exists, why it's part of Russia instead of Europe, and how in the world a place like this can survive when it's encircled by an alliance Russia so fears at a time when Russia, and therefore Kaliningrad, is very much at war. The land known today as Kaliningrad has changed hands several times over the course of history, but one thing has remained constant there for a millennium and perhaps even longer. Kaliningrad, no matter its allegiance and no matter what name that territory has been called, is a fortress. Situated at the base of a small peninsula jutting out into the Baltic Sea where the landmass of continental Europe turns a corner from the dense forests of Lithuania to the rolling plains of Poland, it's had real strategic value as a defensible position for a very long time, and as such, it's been a military installation that has morphed and changed with history, but never went away. Just before we continue with today's video, I want to talk to you about something super important, and that is your personal data. Did you know that your information is probably out there being bought and sold by data brokers? Pretty scary stuff, and that's where today's sponsor, Incogni, comes in. Incogni is a service that helps protect your personal data from being sold online. They reach out to data brokers on your behalf, requesting the removal of your personal information and ensuring that it stays off the market. Signing up is super easy. First, create an account and let them know whose data they're protecting. Next, grant them the right to act on your behalf, and then just sit back, relax, and they'll handle everything. It's peace of mind, so you don't have to worry about your data being out there for anyone to see. Incogni does all of the heavy lifting, so you don't have to. Plus, they've got a 30-day risk-free trial, and if you use the promo code PLACES, you get 60% off an annual plan. Just go to incogni.com/places and take your personal data back with Incogni. Thanks to them for sponsoring, and now back to today's episode. 1,000 years ago, though, this little stretch of Baltic land didn't go by the name Kaliningrad at all. Instead, it was called Twangsta, a modest fort held by a minor tribe of the Baltic people known as the Old Prussians. That minor tribe were called the Sambians, and in essence, they were Vikings, exercising control over two unique land bridges that still define Kaliningrad's surroundings to this day. Those land bridges, the Vistula Spit and the Curonian Spit, are very narrow forested shoals estimated to only be some 5,000 years old themselves, protecting a northward lagoon and a southward lagoon that provided ample fishing grounds for the people who lived on their shores. The Sambians weren't the only tribe in the area, but they appeared to be among the most powerful, helped along by their control of the Twangtse and other forts in the area. They were leading amber traders, known to be at least relatively wealthy for the time, and with their valuable control over amber, they were able to enjoy furs, honey, and other imports that passed through their lands as Scandinavia and the Baltic tribes conducted trade with Germania. But in the year 1255, Germania would assert itself against the Sambians in devastating fashion. The conquest of Twangsta came during the Prussian Crusade as the Teutonic Knights swept northeastward into the Baltic region in an attempt to colonize and convert the pagan population of the area. Against the might of the Teutonic Order, the Sambians were unable to stand firm, and when their fort was taken, it was converted into a military stronghold for its new captors. They would name the new citadel Königsberg Castle and build a city around it, welcoming wave after wave of German and Polish settlers who turned the local population to a minority. From there, the Teutonic Order struck outward against pagan Lithuania, eventually conquering the territory there too. Like the Sambians before them, the Teutonic Marshal and Diocese in Königsberg enjoyed lucrative and far-reaching trade relationships with the surrounding kingdoms and duchies, and with the arrival of a well-respected nunnery, the city began to build its reputation as a center for education and intellectualism. The city would trade hands a few times over the next few centuries. In 1440, it became a founding member of the Prussian Confederation, an organization to push back against the rule of the Teutonic Order and the exploitative regime it imposed. 14 years later, it was incorporated into Poland, with which it joined the 13 Years' War against the old and corrupt Holy Order. The city was captured by the Teutonic Knights and was the site of multiple battles over the course of the conflict. After the war's end, Königsberg would become the capital of what remained of the Teutonic Order's land holdings, and in the early 1500s, as the city's religious faith shifted during the Protestant Reformation, it eventually joins the new Duchy of Prussia under the territory's coat of arms, the Black Prussian Eagle. With wars and political realignments finished for a time, Königsberg became one of Central Europe's great port cities. A functionally autonomous territory, Königsberg had its own currency, its own parliament, and vibrant cultures rooted in the Polish, German, and Lithuanian languages. Like the Sambian tribe that came before, Königsberg became a flourishing trade center and a critical interlocutor between the kingdoms of Western Europe and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. As a cultural and economic bridge between the two sides of the European continent, Königsberg became a hub for intellectualism, with a city university founded in 1544, with the next several centuries seeing Königsberg punch way above its weight when it came to churning out scientists, mathematicians, writers, and philosophers. As part of Polish Prussia, Königsberg featured prominently at times in the internal power struggles of the Prussian nobility, but it was the city, not any particular noble, that ultimately came out on top of the conflict. Poland placed firm legal protections around Königsberg's autonomy and invested heavily in fortifying the city against potential Swedish attack. During the 30 Years' War, Königsberg would see Prussia become independent, and although the city would deal with plague, reductions in trade, and even a brief annexation by the Russian Empire in the late 1750s, it would end the 18th century as the same booming city it had been at the start. During the years of the Napoleonic conquest, Königsberg would host King Frederick Wilhelm III of Prussia after he fled Berlin, and it would become a critical center of the anti-Napoleon political movement. A few decades later, it became part of the German Empire when the Prussian monarchy eventually unified it, and as part of the unification, Königsberg was fortified even further. It'd be surrounded by a series of 15 lesser forts, all oriented around the city. By then, Königsberg was surrounded by 3 separate defensive belts, making it among the most well-defended cities in all of Europe and easily the best defended of the German Empire. And unsurprisingly, for a city of such a military investment, it became a point of considerable strategic value when World War I broke out. With the Russians pressing in on the Germans from the east, Königsberg was the place that simply could not be lost, lest a Russian conquest of such a vital point cause a cascade into subsequent Russian victories, a morale crisis on the home front, and the means for the Tsar and his men to completely overrun Germany's other static defenses. With no other choice, the Germans resolved to stand and defend the city, and from their perspective, it was a good thing they did. Out beyond their supply lines, hungry and low in morale, the Russians walked into a trap at the Battle of Tannenberg, not far from Königsberg. 120,000 Russians would be killed, wounded, or go missing in the battle, a figure representing nearly 10 for every 1 casualty on the German side. After that, the war didn't threaten Königsberg in any substantive way, and the fortress city notched another de facto victory by the nature of its own survival. The Weimar years between the world wars saw the end of the Kingdom of Prussia and the destruction of the German Empire. Yet Königsberg, despite being far from the heart of the lands now called Germany, wasn't relinquished to the Poles, or the Russians, or the Lithuanians. Along with the rest of East Prussia, it was recognized as a geographically isolated part of the German nation, separated from the rest of the nation's territory by a strip of Polish lands that reached the Baltic coast. Königsberg and the surrounding area were the site of substantial infrastructure investments, less to do with reconstruction and more to do with preparing East Prussia for its survival off on its own. But when one particular German man with a little toothbrush moustache and a bad hairdo started looking for axes to grind against the Weimar state, East Prussia's predicament seemed to fit the bill. Königsberg was a prime target for Hitler's original groups of paramilitaries even before he took power, and the city's intellectual class got the worst of it owing to their role in the ideological side of the Weimar Republic. Jews had lived among the other residents of Königsberg peacefully for centuries, and so the city's Jewish population was a prime target for Nazi confiscations, discrimination, and eventually purges. They were deported to concentration camps and death camps, Auschwitz becoming the most common destination once it opened in 1940. All the while, Königsberg featured prominently in Hitler's rhetoric whenever he visited or touched on East Prussia, discussing Königsberg as a perfect location for the Hitlerian ideal of agrarian settlement by small-time German farmers. When Germany invaded Poland, Poles in Königsberg were tortured and executed, at times even by guillotine in the streets. Nearly 70,000 among their number were forced into slave labor just inside Königsberg itself, in horrific conditions where death was common. As the Second World War drew to its conclusion, Königsberg was among the cities to be subjected to the full force of British bombing, with the vast majority of the old city, including its castle, its universities, and its economic centers, razed to the ground. Then it was the Red Army's chance to take its turn, with the city putting it under siege in the early months of 1945. By then, the Soviets were well aware of Hitler's desire to turn Königsberg into a museum of sorts, showing off the innumerable spoils of war that Hitler thought he would secure during the Nazi invasion there. So too did the people of Königsberg know full well that the Soviets had committed massacres and numerous other atrocities over the course of their conquest. After 3 months besieging a city that most civilians had long since fled, Königsberg fell under the control of the Soviets despite fanatical resistance from many of the Nazi troops there. Eventually, the fortress had to declare its surrender, an exceptionally rare event in its 1,000-year history. Of the pre-war population of roughly 120,000 German civilians, just 1 in 5 would live to see the siege's end, with 3 out of every 4 dead killed by hunger. Over the coming few years, its remaining German population would first be whittled down via forced migration, and then the remainder would be expelled outright by 1950, written off as lifelong fascists who could simply never be reformed. When peace was finally restored on the European continent, Königsberg became a de facto territorial holding of the Soviet Union, and eventually it received its new name, Kaliningrad, named after a Bolshevik revolutionary called Mikhail Kalinin, who had no real relation to the city. Kalinin was, by that point, a very high-ranking Soviet leader, and the Union apparently felt that he was in need of a city to honor his legacy or something. Actually, apparently he needed 3 cities, because 2 in the Soviet Union already bore his name. At that time, Kaliningrad was something of a legal grey area. It wouldn't be assigned to the Soviet Union formally until 1990, and although it eventually was regarded as a piece of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, or SSR, that was pretty unusual. On the eastern side of the Iron Curtain, most territory that hadn't belonged to a Soviet SSR in the past was kept at least nominally independent. For example, Poland was placed under the control of a puppet government called the Polish People's Republic. Kaliningrad, though, had been an isolated pocket of conquered nations stuck deep inside territory under Joseph Stalin's control, and if Stalin decreed that it was to be a part of the Russian SSR, then so it was. But that new reality for Kaliningrad brought with it a second and far more welcome change for the people who lived there. Unlike Berlin or Warsaw, Kaliningrad would see little in the way of heavy-handed Soviet oversight in its early years, largely owing to the mass expulsion of Germans and a wave of Russian settlers. The Red Army stuck around for a while, but by 1948 the vast majority of the city's population hailed from Russia, Belarus, or Ukraine. Many of them were collectivist farmers who were enticed to the city by a variety of intriguing offers. They were promised everything from new homes to a free cow to tax breaks to travel passports that were exceptionally hard for agricultural workers to come by. Now, those promises largely turned out to be empty, with the houses they were promised actually consisting of ruins, but in a way, that was the point. By then, they'd already arrived, and so it fell to that wave of new arrivals to rebuild the city, its infrastructure, and most of all, its factories. After that wave of arrivals, the next round would come by way of assignment, shipped off by order of community leaders back in Russia. Those leaders, incentivized to get rid of the farmers who'd been causing problems for their collectives and keep the ones that were productive, used cities like Kaliningrad to get rid of the poorly educated, heavy drinkers, petty criminals, the physically weak, and others who were deemed to be of lesser working value. For Kaliningrad to be sent so many people who had been deemed cast-offs from the Soviet system, well, it wasn't exactly a great sign on where the territory was headed. But it was the sort of thing that could be overcome, with communities banding together and resolving to find ways forward despite an imperfect situation. The larger problem came from Moscow, when in the immediate post-war years, Kaliningrad was treated as little more than an afterthought. It wasn't the sort of place that got a special shout-out in the first post-war 5-year plan, and in fact, it wasn't even the sort of place that got budget allotments. Despite the Russian population flowing in, it was a place with not nearly enough laborers to carry out a full reconstruction and socialist reform, and nor did it have the money to do it either. In Kaliningrad, that was especially frustrating. Back when it was Königsberg, it was the sort of modern city that far outstripped anything the Soviet Union had to offer, and both the basic infrastructure and, before their expulsion, the German experts and engineers who could have helped to rebuild it were right there waiting for an investment. Instead, the new wave of settlers had no clean water, only minimal electricity, and nothing more than ruins at the heart of the city. The plans for reconstruction, drawn up in large part by the people living there, were grandiose in their imagination. The city was to be entirely de-Germanized, not just getting rid of the Nazi symbolism, but dispensing of parts of the old town that had been built in the German style or kept as architectural relics of the medieval period. The ruins of Königsberg Castle would be demolished for good in the late 1960s by direct order of then-Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. Instead, the new Kaliningrad would resemble Moscow of the 1930s, grand, wide boulevards that came out in spokes from the central square, and a great tower topped with a statue of Lenin at its peak. In reality, though, the people of the city would need several decades to rebuild the city centre, and so for a very long time, the real hub of the settlement was located out in the suburbs. What most regions of the world would consider to be a true city, Kaliningrad wouldn't resemble again for a very long time, and the million-odd people who lived in the territory by 1950 would have to make do with less. Fishing became a dominant industry, propping up the region's economy, and oceanography slowly became the leading scientific focus of the intellectual culture that still existed there. During the Cold War, Kaliningrad was a closed city, one of a number of Soviet settlements that banned visits from foreigners, barred most Soviet citizens from entry, and functioned largely as a self-contained human ecosystem. While other such cities in the Soviet Union were closed because of the military-industrial work happening there, like in arms plants that developed new secretive Soviet capabilities and nuclear research sites that built atomic bombs, Kaliningrad's situation was a bit different. It was closed instead for security reasons, preserved as a stronghold that couldn't be compromised in the same way as, say, Poland or East Germany could be. It had tremendous military value to the Soviets, with its strategic location on the Baltic Sea and its ability to defend the Baltic SSRs in the event of a war with the global West. Not only that, but pro-Western Baltic residents were kept separate from the rest of Europe, courtesy of this little Russian peninsula. And beyond that strategic value, it had little else to offer, so closed it was. And closed it would remain through quiet Soviet years that saw stagnation, slow reconstruction, and very little more than that. Kaliningrad's dreary monotony would be broken for the first time in nearly half a century in 1991 when the Soviet Union fractured beyond all hope of recovery and ceased to exist. When the Union collapsed, Kaliningrad was left as an official holding of Russia in an arrangement that Moscow had made sure to get officially finalized in 1990. In another history, Kaliningrad might have become a part of Lithuania, as the Lithuanian SSR had played a key role in overseeing it and had lent it a large proportion of the support that it did receive. But now, Kaliningrad was part of the Russian Federation, with Lithuania to the north and east, Poland to the south, Latvia and Estonia just a short coastal hop away, and Germany, Sweden, Denmark and Finland encircling its holdings on the Baltic Sea. But Russia's enthusiasm to keep Kaliningrad hadn't been an accident. Although it didn't compromise the entirety of what used to be the Soviet Union, Russia would retain the vast majority of military assets and infrastructure, including a vast nuclear arsenal that still granted it strategic parity with the United States. Russia at the time was in no place to assert a multipolar world order, and the rest of the globe knew it, but given that they did still have those military assets, it was going to be a good idea to at least leave themselves the option to use them. In that sense, Kaliningrad was absolutely vital. Russia has very little means to access the Atlantic Ocean. Its Arctic sea routes are blocked off by ice. Its northernmost Atlantic seaside between Estonia and Finland is frozen for much of the year, and while it can sail ships through the Black Sea, its ability to pass from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean is granted at the pleasure of Turkey, the owner of the narrow Bosphorus Strait and a proud member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO, since 1952. Kaliningrad was the answer to that problem, with the territory's more southerly towns being Russia's only dependable, ice-free, sovereign-held outlet to the Atlantic. When the Russian Federation took the reins in Moscow, Kaliningrad became home to Russia's Baltic Fleet, a formidable and historically well-valued institution that had 350 warships to its name in 1991. But like everything else in Russia at that time, the fleet was in sharp decline, and 4 years later, not even a third of those vessels would still be operable. Though it had the firepower, on paper, to be considered a dangerous spectre for the Western world, it was little more than a paper tiger in practice, at least during those years. At the same time, Russia's land forces in the area diminished in a similar fashion. But even still, the amount of firepower stored up in Kaliningrad ensured that it was just as much a fortress then as it ever had been. It wasn't about to be launching any invasions of NATO countries, but nor was it worth the alliance's trouble to start a war over, with several thousand warheads still pointed in their direction. When Poland and Lithuania joined the alliance, and then the European Union, it may have represented a nominal increase in the risk that Kaliningrad faced, but in practice, the situation was fundamentally unchanged from the exclave's perspective. Well protected from any threat of NATO interference, Kaliningrad was all but certain to survive the coming years, but how it would thrive was a much harder question to answer. Russia was able to secure special transit arrangements for Kaliningrad citizens who had to travel through the rest of Europe if they wanted to go to the rest of Russia via a land route, but those arrangements could be undone with a snap of a finger if Europe saw fit. No, Kaliningrad needed to be just as important to the Europeans as it was to Russia, and in the mid-1990s there was a prime example of how to do just that, located halfway around the world. At that time, Hong Kong was just about to be handed back to China as a special economic zone, and under Russian then-President Boris Yeltsin, the idea of turning Kaliningrad into a Russian Hong Kong seemed to be a good one. To that end, Russia designated Kaliningrad in 1996 as the Yantar Special Economic Zone, with Yantar translating to amber in Russian, recalling the millennia-long wash of amber onto Baltic shores. Located closer to Berlin and Stockholm than it was to Moscow, Kaliningrad was a natural fit with the European economy, and Moscow sought to help that process along. Implementing a customs-free zone with low corporate profit and property taxes, it even drew international praise as exactly the concept Russia had hoped for, the Hong Kong of the Baltic Sea. But unfortunately, that idea turned out to be short-lived, and it would only be a couple more years before Kaliningrad was back in the mud. Now, there are a few reasons for failure there, all compounding at once to doom the idea. The laws that protected corporations and free trade were vague, with ample loopholes and blind spots that made international and Russian entities nervous to do business there. It didn't have very much to export, and attempts at making it into a manufacturing center largely failed, meaning that before long it turned into an entity that basically existed to purchase German and Polish goods and send them to the rest of Russia. Then Russia's economy crashed in 1998, just 2 years after the Yantar SEZ was designated, basically dooming the entire thing. Kaliningrad held that special label until 2016, but by then it hadn't been good for much. In a practical sense, it built Kaliningrad's reputation back in Russia because it could take goods that were produced in the EU and shipped in and then relabel them made in Kaliningrad. Plus, tax-free status never hurt a corporation, and Kaliningrad's enterprises had very much enjoyed its perks. But the Yantar SEZ led to almost no large-scale change in Kaliningrad, and when the designation was revoked, it made little practical difference to the rest of the world. Since then, Kaliningrad has weathered multiple up and downs, some owing to the after effects of the Yantar SEZ. The Putin regime has helped in ways after Russia's current president first came to power in the year 2000, and the regional economy did grow significantly during Putin's first 2 terms. In 2007, the region opened a brand new airport terminal at a price tag equivalent to $45 million. The global financial crisis of 2008 was a major nail in the coffin, sending unemployment climbing and lowering the region's fortunes overall. In 2015, the then governor of Kaliningrad, a man named Nikolai Sukhanov, insisted that Kaliningrad's quality of life and wages were on par with Lithuania, but the real situation was far worse. Kaliningrad's top job became a revolving door of Kremlin toadies, each of whom would come in, take a look at the territory, find out it couldn't really be helped, and then get booted out in favor of whatever optimists hadn't yet had a chance to actually look at the books and, well, still thought that they could fix it. And in the 21st century, Russia has taken pains to wall off Kaliningrad from Western ideology, in a move that's seen the enclave get far more insular in both intended and unintended ways. The territory hasn't been able to grow into the sort of regional negotiation ground between Europe and Russia that it might have become. Instead, it's been kept painstakingly out of European affairs by Russia. Russia's attempts to block off information about Kaliningrad's relative economic deprivation from its own people then led to a decision by Poland to wall Kaliningrad off for a while, a change that just happened to coincide with far lower petty crime and smuggling in Poland after the change was made. The visits that Kaliningrad citizens routinely make to EU countries have grown more contentious and more likely to draw suspicion. Conversely, EU nations have held it at more and more of an arm's length as massive political corruption scandals have become synonymous with the exclave's leadership, and money laundering appeared to have become commonplace. At the core of it all seems to be Russian fears that Kaliningrad could attempt secession if it's not kept tightly within Vladimir Putin's grasp. Decentralization is not a concept that Moscow has ever done particularly well with, and even less so during its 20-some years of Putin in command. Even beyond the man himself, Putin's regime has been noted for its paranoia and its seeming certainty that it must hold Russia together with force if it's going to be held together at all. And perhaps that's deserved. Staring outward at prosperous Sweden, rising Poland, stable and peaceful Lithuania and its other Western neighbors, and it's not inconceivable that the people of Kaliningrad might long for greener pastures, even if the exclave's behavior thus far indicates that it actually quite likes being a part of Russia. Yet for Moscow, letting go of Kaliningrad is the sort of fearsome prospect that must be addressed with strength, not just because of the considerable black eye that might come from losing it. Far more important is the fact that losing Kaliningrad, now as much as ever throughout its history, means losing a fortress. We've alluded to the military value of Kaliningrad throughout this episode so far, but it's time that we really zoom in and examine just how much of a stronghold this little exclave really is. And in doing so, we've got to emphasize that it hasn't been such a military powerhouse during the early years of the Russian Federation, although Russia might have wanted it to be. But in the years of turmoil and division that followed after Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, the territory has been built up into one of the most well-defended stretches of land in the world. For Kaliningrad, all discussions of military might must begin with the Baltic Fleet. As of 2022, the Baltic Fleet was estimated to include a grand total of 52 surface warships, including no fewer than 4 highly potent Sterengushi-class corvettes. These are ships that can engage in naval battles with enemy vessels, attack and defend coasts, hunt down submarines, and a lot more. Of the 9 Russia has built so far, 4 are assigned to the Baltic, each crewed by 90 sailors on a vessel with some 1,800 tons of displacement. They've got very powerful onboard anti-ship cruise missiles, plus anti-submarine and anti-ship torpedoes, and a whole range of big guns, and they're a favorite of Russia to sail around the world in order to show off the nation's military power. Also part of the Baltic Fleet are the significantly larger Soviet-era New Strashimi-class frigates, of which only 2 are still active, both of which are central to the fleet in Kaliningrad. They've got offensive hardware to take down half a dozen enemy ships with direct anti-ship missile hits, or bring down some 30-plus enemy aircraft if their aim is particularly good, not to mention several highly potent torpedoes. The fleet also included a range of impressive landing craft, protective corvettes and minesweepers, small and stealthy missile boats, and at least 1 Kilo-class attack submarine. Altogether, that military force has been more than enough to directly challenge the Polish Navy through the end of the 2010s, nullify the navies of all 3 Baltic states and Finland, and give a very hard time to the vessels of the Swedish Navy, despite that country's proud ownership of 5 stealth corvettes by 2015. As of 2021, Kaliningrad also hosted Russia's 11th Army Corps, with an estimated strength at that time of anywhere between 12 and 18,000 troops. Along with the 11th came Russian main battle tanks, artillery pieces, and other heavy-duty warfighting equipment. They were joined by a substantial air arm under the command of the 336th Guards Naval Infantry Brigade, with 4 squadrons worth of fighter jets to its name. Those included the modernized Su-30SM, an advanced 4th-generation aircraft roughly comparable to America's F-15E Strike Eagle, along with the Su-27 Air Superiority Fighter and the ground attack Su-24. At least on paper, those 4 squadrons would be enough to establish air superiority over all 3 of the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, or cause serious trouble for the Polish Air Force of that time. Even worse, for a potential military adversary, Kaliningrad at that time was home to no fewer than 4 battalions of Russia's vaunted S-400 surface-to-air missile system, a number that since climbed up to a purported total of 6. Now, it's important to emphasize that any one-time look at what Russia had in Kaliningrad, or for that matter what Russia has at any of its military installations, does not represent what it'll have there at any point in the future. Russia is known to move its military hardware around a fair bit, and the specifics on what a person might find in Kaliningrad, if they were to go looking, would almost certainly be a bit different from what we've laid out here. But more important is the sheer amount of military equipment present on this little slice of the Baltic coast. Between its aircraft, its coastal defense vessels, and its substantial number of available troops and heavy machinery on the ground, it's the sort of place where Putin himself can rest assured that NATO would never attempt to take by force, if, of course, you suppose that NATO has much interest at all. Not only that, but it's been regarded as a very powerful symbol of Russian offensive potency in the Baltic, a body of water that would otherwise be regarded as, quote, a NATO lake. That's been especially relevant prior to the mid-2020s. for Lithuania and its other Western neighbors, and it's not inconceivable that the people of Kaliningrad Kaliningrad might long for greener pastures, even if the exclave's behavior thus far indicates that it actually quite likes being a part of Russia. Yet for Moscow, letting go of Kaliningrad is the sort of fearsome prospect that must be addressed with strength, not just because of the considerable black eye that might come from losing it. Far more important is the fact that losing Kaliningrad, now as much as ever throughout its history, means losing a fortress. We've alluded to the military value of Kaliningrad throughout this episode so far, but it's time that we really zoom in and examine just how much of a stronghold this little exclave really is. And in doing so, we've got to emphasize that it hasn't been such a military powerhouse during the early years of the Russian Federation, although Russia might have wanted it to be. But in the years of turmoil and division that followed after Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, the territory has been built up into one of the most well-defended stretches of land in the world. For Kaliningrad, all discussions of military might must begin with the Baltic Fleet. As of 2022, the Baltic Fleet was estimated to include a grand total of 52 surface warships, including no fewer than 4 highly potent Sterengushi-class corvettes. These are ships that can engage in naval battles with enemy vessels, attack and defend coasts, hunt down submarines, and a lot more. Of the 9 Russia has built so far, 4 are assigned to the Baltic, each crewed by 90 sailors on a vessel with some 1,800 tons of displacement. They've got very powerful onboard anti-ship cruise missiles, plus anti-submarine and anti-ship torpedoes, and a whole range of big guns, and they're a favorite of Russia to sail around the world in order to show off the nation's military power. Also part of the Baltic Fleet are the significantly larger Soviet-era Neustrashimy-class frigates, of which only 2 are still active, both of which are central to the fleet in Kaliningrad. They've got offensive hardware to take down half a dozen enemy ships with direct anti-ship missile hits, or bring down some 30-plus enemy aircraft if their aim is particularly good, not to mention several highly potent torpedoes. The fleet also included a range of impressive landing craft, protective corvettes and minesweepers, small and stealthy missile boats, and at least 1 Kilo-class attack submarine. Altogether, that military force has been more than enough to directly challenge the Polish Navy through the end of the 2010s, nullify the navies of all 3 Baltic states and Finland, and give a very hard time to the vessels of the Swedish Navy, despite that country's proud ownership of 5 stealth corvettes by 2015. As of 2021, Kaliningrad also hosted Russia's 11th Army Corps, with an estimated strength at that time of anywhere between 12 and 18,000 troops. Along with the 11th came Russian main battle tanks, artillery pieces, and other heavy-duty warfighting equipment. They were joined by a substantial air arm under the command of the 336th Guards Naval Infantry Brigade, with 4 squadrons worth of fighter jets to its name. Those included the modernized Su-30SM, an advanced 4th-generation aircraft roughly comparable to America's F-15E Strike Eagle, along with the Su-27 Air Superiority Fighter and the ground attack Su-24. At least on paper, those 4 squadrons would be enough to establish air superiority over all 3 of the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, or cause serious trouble for the Polish Air Force of that time. Even worse, for a potential military adversary, Kaliningrad at that time was home to no fewer than 4 battalions of Russia's vaunted S-400 surface-to-air missile system, a number that's since climbed up to a purported total of 6. Now, it's important to emphasize that any one-time look at what Russia had in Kaliningrad, or for that matter what Russia has at any of its military installations, does not represent what it'll have there at any point in the future. Russia is known to move its military hardware around a fair bit, and the specifics on what a person might find in Kaliningrad, if they were to go looking, would almost certainly be a bit different from what we've laid out here. But more important is the sheer amount of military equipment present on this little slice of the Baltic coast. Between its aircraft, its coastal defense vessels, and its substantial number of available troops and heavy machinery on the ground, it's the sort of place where Putin himself can rest assured that NATO would never attempt to take by force, if, of course, you suppose that NATO has much interest at all. Not only that, but it's been regarded as a very powerful symbol of Russian offensive potency in the Baltic, a body of water that would otherwise be regarded as, quote, a NATO lake. That's been especially relevant prior to the mid-2020s, when neither Finland nor Sweden were NATO nations, and the presence of Russian forces in Kaliningrad were critical to Russia's ability to disrupt Swedish and Finnish ideas that they might, in a sense, get all the NATO defensive benefits without signing the paperwork. A snarling Russian bear on the doorstep has a certain way of disrupting those illusions. Now, with all of that being said, there has long been reason for the Western world to suspect that Russia's forces in Kaliningrad may not be quite so potent as Russia may have wanted everyone to believe. Take, for example, the flagship of the Baltic Sea, a Soviet-era destroyer that should, on paper, pose a considerable threat even by itself. displacing some 6,600 tons and clocking in at a length of 156 meters, that's 512 feet. The Nastachivi, as she's known, comes with a complement of 350 crewmen operating a very dangerous arsenal of big guns, anti-ship and anti-aircraft missiles, as well as torpedoes. The only problem, though, is that she hasn't really done much since the early 2010s, and since 2019 she's been stuck in a sort of purgatory of ongoing repairs, mirroring the fate of a number of Russian vessels that the country doesn't seem to have the capacity to get back into active service. And the asterisks around the big, scary Baltic fleet go a bit further than that. Take, for example, its relative lack of submarines, with its sole attack submarine having been commissioned all the way back in 1990. Its Kilo class of submarines have seen many among their number decommissioned years ago, and it's unclear whether the sub is in fighting shape at all. For a good indicator of why it might not be, take the Russian nuclear submarine Kazan, which has, at the time of writing, been making international headlines for having been sailed to the coast of Cuba and observed falling apart on the way. While the Kazan is a different class of submarine than the one the Baltic Fleet's got, it's also supposed to be traveling abroad as a Russian showpiece, paraded in front of an American audience for reasons of grandstanding and intimidation, and even that one is falling apart. Meanwhile, the Baltic Fleet is known to have had problems with its readiness levels in the past, with the fleet's pre-2016 commander dismissed in June of that year, along with his chief of staff, for, quote, serious training shortcomings and distortion of the real situation. And finally, there's the simpler reality of what the Baltic Fleet comprises as compared to Russia's three other principal fleets. Although it's certainly meant to look big and threatening, it's the smallest of the four overall in terms of its warships and submarines, and certainly it lacks teeth compared to the Black Sea Fleet, the Arctic Northern Fleet, and the Pacific Fleet. Its relative level of intimidation toward Europe is helped along by proximity, where its base in Kaliningrad means that it's constantly menacing NATO directly, but how much of a menace it actually is a different question entirely. In an actual military engagement, it's widely expected to fill a primarily defensive role in a hypothetical conflict with NATO, doing its best to hold out until Russia can roll through the Baltics and turn it into a forward operating base once it's connected to the rest of Russia by land. The idea that it could outright win naval battles against nearby nations only holds water as long as we forget that an attack on NATO members would trigger a massive response from all of NATO, which would include the sort of immediate retaliation that would see the Baltic Fleet just wiped off the map very quickly. The idea that Russian ships could ever pass the Danish Strait and escape the Baltic in wartime, perhaps to cause havoc among North Atlantic shipping lanes, is even more laughable. But Kaliningrad does pose a real offensive threat to Europe for one other military reason: its arsenal of nuclear-capable Iskander missiles, which were made permanent in 2018. A mobile ballistic missile system, the Iskander is believed to have a range of roughly 500 kilometers, 300 miles, bringing Warsaw, Stockholm, and Berlin into its crosshairs. Also in range are most parts of the three Baltic states and a large radius of Poland. Russia first deployed the missiles to Kaliningrad years prior to 2018 as a temporary measure designed to protest what Russia perceived as the buildup of NATO and US troops in the Baltic, owing largely to the installation of a ballistic missile defense system there. According to most NATO members, the move to place Iskander missiles there at all has been perceived as an implicit threat, and making the missile placements permanent made the threat permanent too. Per still images released in June of 2024, those missiles are still there, and while Russia doesn't disclose whether it keeps nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad at all, a site that appears to actively store nuclear weapons appears to have been conveniently renovated just in time for the permanent Iskander deployment in 2018. Alongside the Iskander, another Russian coastal defense system called the Bastion P is advertised by Russia to be so powerful that it can attack the entrance to the Baltic Sea from the Atlantic, potentially sealing off the body of water and forcing Europe to deal with Kaliningrad using only the ships it already stations around the Baltic coast. So, while the ships, aircraft, and other military assets stationed in Kaliningrad are perhaps more of a threatening showpiece than a force that could conquer the nations of the Baltic all by itself, those nations still have ample reason to be nervous when it comes to the territory. And if tensions were high in Europe as Russia was annexing Crimea and supporting a low-grade insurgency in 2014, then they rose all the higher when it appeared as if Russia's Ukrainian ambitions might set off the first major land war in 21st century Europe. Around that time, in the years just before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the threat Kaliningrad posed wasn't so much that it would cause trouble by outright attacking its neighbors. Back then, Russia was expected to roll through Ukraine with authority, but even that would have been a far cry from actually opting into a land war with Europe. But what Kaliningrad could do was meddle with other goings-on across Europe in order to occupy, distract, or deter NATO from getting involved. One such way Kaliningrad could have done so was to combine Russia's broader Ukraine offensive with a simultaneous and far smaller crisis in the Baltic. For example, as we've already mentioned, Sweden and Finland weren't NATO members at this time, and while landing troops on the mainland of either nation would have been a royally bad idea, those nations also happen to have a whole lot of islands. In a best-case scenario, the Baltic fleet certainly could have pushed a few landing crafts worth of troops onto an uninhabited or sparsely populated island or two, threatening to annex it and dividing Europe's attention in the process. In a far more dangerous scenario, the Baltic fleet probably could have occupied, say, the Swedish island of Gotland, a 3,200 square kilometer, 1,229 square mile island with a population of 61,000 as of 2023. Although Sweden happened to re-establish its Gotland Regiment for potential defense of the islands with the not-so-coincidental timing of the year 2018, the regiment was only expected to have a full strength of 350 soldiers by 2020, and Gotland has no known air or naval defenses to speak of. Take that, and the military assets of Kaliningrad would have handed Moscow a valuable bargaining chip. We give Sweden its island back when you agree to recognize Russia's annexation of Ukraine. All of that without pissing off any NATO member nations directly and without triggering an alliance-wide response. Just as potent as an attack on other Baltic nations directly was the Kaliningrad fleet's ability to conduct hybrid attacks undersea. While the Baltic Fleet is, as we've established, not the most threatening naval power in practice, it's got a robust capacity to engage in all types of undersea mischief, from attacks on internet cables and telecommunication lines to the disruption of energy infrastructure. Highest risk of all is the Baltic Connector, a bi-directional natural gas pipeline that went online at the end of 2019, just as Russia's desire for Ukrainian conquest was growing increasingly overt. A 151-kilometer, 94-mile pipeline, the Baltic Connector can ship up to 2.6 billion cubic meters annually between Finland and Estonia, and it's a very important piece of infrastructure for both nations as well as Latvia further south. Damage the pipeline, or sever it entirely, and the Kaliningrad fleet could have caused major issues for that part of Europe. Threatened to do so, and just like with a potential Gotland invasion, Europe might have found itself somewhat more willing than usual to accept unfavorable terms for Russian peace. Even before the Ukraine war, Russia was known to be mapping out the seafloor in the Baltic, potentially in efforts to identify potential targets should they be needed. And even if Kaliningrad didn't become a particularly active player in the coming war, it still had the capacity to be a thorn in NATO's side for the long term, as an emboldened Russia would invariably turn its attention to territory that it saw as rightfully its own. That included the nations closest to Kaliningrad, the Baltics, which had been Soviet socialist republics during the Cold War, and Poland, where Russia had long asserted its claim of rightful leadership. Ships and aircraft based in Kaliningrad were more than capable of conducting the sort of nuisance flyovers that could generate global headlines on a weekly basis, and the sort of grandiose spectacles, parking warships just off NATO coasts in international waters, that contribute to perceptions of Russia as unpredictable, militarily powerful, and genuinely threatening. If NATO ever did need to use force against Russia, Kaliningrad could quickly turn into a sort of spring-loaded trap, using its military forces to burst out in all directions and cause chaos that would obstruct NATO's ability to defend Poland and the Baltics at all. Kaliningrad could very quickly go from an isolated exclave to the linchpin of a Russian land grab in NATO nations. Fittingly, NATO member nations, and particularly the United States, made clear their own willingness to take out Kaliningrad's defenses and render it functionally useless in the event that large-scale hostilities did break out. When the then commander of the US Air Forces in Europe, General Jeff Harrigan, spoke about the territory in 2019, it was by assuring Western defense reporters that the US could take Kaliningrad out using well-practiced plans that were, as yet, unspecified. Per Harrigan, those assaults would come by air, land, sea, and cyberspace in a lightning offensive that would see radars and communication networks brought to their knees, nullify the S-400 defense air systems and Iskander missiles on Kaliningrad's territory, and open the door for large-scale bombing attacks. Mock attacks conducted by the US Air Force in 2019 saw B-52 bombers fly simulated nuclear cruise missile attack runs, although it was expected at that time that a strike to dispatch Kaliningrad probably wouldn't involve nuclear weapons if it absolutely didn't have to. By the start of the year 2022, Kaliningrad and Russia had enticed the nations of Europe into a Mexican standoff. Russia was pointing its guns at Ukraine, and Ukraine was pointing its guns at Russia. NATO too was pointing its guns at Russia proper, but also at Kaliningrad, which was pointing its own guns at the nations of the Baltic Rim. Any disruption to that fine balance risked setting off the whole thing. And when the war eventually came in February of that year, it risked drawing the entirety of Northern Europe into a new and massive conflict. Luckily for all parties involved, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine did not result in a showdown between Kaliningrad and the Baltics. The fleet at Kaliningrad's naval port remained in place, and the anticipated steamrolling of Ukraine didn't go nearly as Moscow had planned it. With none of the major military success that they'd anticipated, NATO was not faced with the imminent prospect of Russian tanks lining up on the border and staring down the Baltic states, nor streaming into a new long standoff between Russian troops surged into Belarus and occupied Ukraine on one side, and Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and other NATO members on the other. Kaliningrad's dastardly services would, in fact, not be needed, at least not yet, and continental Europe could rest easy knowing that Ukraine was still responsible for a time for its collective defense. But while the Russia-Ukrainian war didn't massively shift the state of affairs across Europe, it was a rather immediate problem for Kaliningrad, where, now that the tables were turned, the enclave was one part fortress and one part hostage. Far from Russia's land borders and cut off from maritime routes due to sea ice for much of the year, Kaliningrad's reliance on Poland and Lithuania for supplies became a massive issue. Because it's not nearly agriculturally productive enough to support itself, Kaliningrad could now be starved. And even if it wasn't, the threat that it might be was enough to grant the EU some powerful leverage. Isolated and encircled, Kaliningrad had little means to resist becoming cut off from Moscow. And with the Ukraine war waging on, that's exactly what Kaliningrad has seen since the start of the conflict. It's at about this time that we'd like to turn to the people who call Kaliningrad home today and see what, if anything, we can glean about their lives in this profoundly unique set of circumstances. Now, as ever, Kaliningrad is not an easy place for Western media to reach, but we do at least know some things, and they are worth sharing to try and get a sense of what it's like to live in a place quietly and informally. First, we'll run through the basics. Kaliningrad is a region of some 1 million or so people living in an area that measures a hair over 15,000 square kilometers. Kaliningrad city itself is home to some 450,000 people thereabouts. Kaliningrad's the first drives on the right-hand side with a license plate starting in either 39 or 91, and they quite likely live in an urban area rather than a rural one. A woman in Kaliningrad can expect to live to age 75. For men, 66. Per capita, Kaliningrad pulls in about $10,000 for every person there annually, although the returns that locals see are a good bit lower than that. People who live there are likely to work in the fishing industry, in engineering, in papermaking, or in the lumber trade. Some, though, still may work in the amber trade, where Kaliningrad remains the world's leading producer of the stuff, with over 90% of the world's known deposits located there. Over the course of the last few decades, Kaliningrad has never been an easy place to live. In the 1990s, it was a miserable place to be, with a poverty rate well over 50%. At that time, Kaliningrad held the dubious record of hosting the highest HIV rate in all of Russia, alongside a narcotic-centered drug abuse problem that far outstripped what most global cities had to deal with. It had been a place of economic and cultural isolation even before the fall of the Soviet Union, and with the Russian economy in shambles following the Union, Kaliningrad became a mere afterthought in the worst possible way. A hotbed for organized crime, Kaliningrad was used for its legal grey areas and loopholes, along with its relative obscurity and distance from Moscow, in order to do, out in the open, what would have been done behind closed doors elsewhere. In the 2000s and 2010s, the city's attempts at an economic boom have raised the prospects of Kaliningrad Russians generally, with crime dropping to fairly low rates and improved, though still not fantastic prospects. Now, relative to the rest of Russia, quality of life and resource availability relatively high, owing to its close proximity to Europe, and for Russians, it's generally considered to be a rather nice place to live. Yet after the war began, Kaliningrad came under a far-reaching but entirely predictable sanctions regime by Lithuania. As the primary nation transiting goods directly into Kaliningrad, Lithuania unilaterally announced in mid-2022 that it would put a stop to the transfer of sanctioned goods into Kaliningrad, including everything from coal to metals to luxury goods to advanced technology. The announcement drew swift condemnation from Moscow, with the Kremlin deriding it as a, quote, unprecedented and illegal move, and the leader of Russia's Security Council vowing that the sanctions would lead to major repercussions for Lithuania. Yet in Kaliningrad, the announcement wasn't taken with nearly as much concern or gravitas, not because the people there didn't believe it would have an impact, but because it didn't call for the sanctioning of critical supplies. Food and medicine would continue to enter
I
Kaliningrad
used
as
to
usual,
quake on
said
the
one
web, and the
Kaliningrad
quake
resident
went
about the sanctions when
splat, and
asked
I
by
went
Euronews,
squish.
quoting here, "Of course, the sanctions, as the previous ones, will leave a mark on our region. Scarce goods will probably not disappear, but it will be for a short time, and I think the government will find a solution to the situation very quickly,
I will say
and everything
though,
will be
like
resolved
I
in the
know
near
I'm
future.
close to being
We aren't
able
panicking."
to.
Another said, "I am not worried because everyone
skip.
was
If I
already
did the-
prepared for
could do
it.
the
I
skip,
don't know
these
why
kills
the
would
government
probably
is
feel a
talking
lot
about it
better.
only now and why they are so shocked. In some ways,
But I,
Kaliningrad
do
has
not
proven
have
more resilient
enough
than most
DPS.
Russian
I have
regions to
close.
Kremlin propaganda. The people who live there are well accustomed to dealing with Europeans, especially Lithuanians, and the wash of spiteful coverage that Russian state media brought cascading onto Europeans after the 24 annexation of Crimea largely fell on deaf ears. In Kaliningrad, attempts to demagogue European nations don't tend to go nearly as far as they do with Russians who've never traveled to Europe or have only done so a few times in their life. Import controls from inside Russia, which attempted for a long time to prohibit Kaliningrad residents from accessing many European foods, instead
you
drove
don't.
people to get well acquainted with Polish supermarkets. This is a place where skepticism against the Putin regime is higher than almost anywhere else. And in fact, that skepticism has led to some
boogeyman.
Kaliningrad residents being relatively understanding of the sanctions
I get
imposed
boogie
upon them,
with it.
viewing them as less the actions of a misguided or devilish European Union and more as a reasonable progression of a two-sided conflict. But social control remains stringent across the exclave, especially since the 2014 annexation. Since then, local authorities in Kaliningrad have taken a far more active role in trying to tamp down on potential sources of dissent. Independent media, even that without an explicitly anti-Putin bent, have largely been run out of the exclave or otherwise shut down, while the region's political opposition has
there
been
and do
choked to the
nothing.
point of
Oh.
non-existence. Nationalism has played more and more of a role in the region's sanctioned politics as authorities within Kaliningrad attempt to explain their own exclave as a place increasingly forced to stand firm against a rising tide of international opposition. In the eyes of some, the story of Kaliningrad is the tragedy of Kaliningrad, a place cut off from the Russian nation to which it so rightfully belongs. The stance of Kaliningrad skeptics, though, can be summed up nicely in this clip from a Guardian article published in 2018, and we quote here, "Ahead of trips to Moscow, people will routinely say, 'I'm going to Russia.' One local laughed when I pointed out that he was already there." The quote ends. More and more attempts to recognize Kaliningrad's historical, political, or even geographical separation from Russia have been derided as Germanization, in reference to the Prussian heritage there that Russia so disdains, and Germanization by Russia's same logic is a short step away from separatism. Since Lithuania imposed sanctions on Kaliningrad, the exclave does not appear to have grown more fervent in its support for Moscow, although the sanctions regime broadened somewhat in July 2022, expanding to include wood, alcohol, and a few other more important goods than had been restricted before. Even those changes weren't the end of the world. The sanctions were amended to allow Russia to ship significant amounts of sanctioned goods back and forth to Kaliningrad annually, including things like steel, antifreeze, and fertilizers that are, in fairness, pretty important for civilian infrastructure. And since then, they haven't been expanded, they haven't been diminished, and
30
despite
seconds
some
before
analyst
my
predictions that the
familiar
Kaliningrad
comes.
economy would begin to crumble, it
I'm
largely
about to
hasn't.
eat, so we're gonna make
Unfortunately,
sure we
the
don't waste
effect
our time.
hasn't gone the opposite way either. The
An
EU's
AFK
continued
Iraq for
engagement with
300%.
Russia over
No, I'm kidding.
Kaliningrad has not led
Gonna
to much
irritate
productive
gross
movement toward a fair peace
Tootsie
settlement in
Pop.
Ukraine, and it's not likely to. But Kaliningrad remains a grey zone in Russia's escalating tensions with the EU, a place where the realities and implications of the war in Ukraine have the potential
Onyxes, right?
to very quickly
Yeah.
change life as residents
Well,
know
if only
it,
I
got-
but
still
where
need-
not much has
I
actually
got access
shifted.
for days.
The
They like
status
the
quo in
fucking Infinity
Kaliningrad,
Stones.
despite
Put
the
that
war,
shit together.
I have
still remains
onyxes.
constant.
Like,
Now, when it comes to the future of
I'm gonna
Kaliningrad,
use all
it's
these.
critically important to understand
gonna
one key
use them
detail.
all.
Peace now does not
No way in
necessarily
hell.
equal stability in the future.
Not for,
Kaliningrad's ability to
fletching,
maintain a
obviously.
tenuous
Come on.
balance with the European Union,
Oh, you're
despite
right.
its status as a full-on
That's
Russian
free
military
Minecraft.
stronghold, has
That's
been
free
a
crafting
welcome
next week.
surprise for those who value peace in the Baltic region. But it is not a guarantee, and with Russian ambitions not yet sated, the potential
on the right
remains
side,
for
look, you could
Kaliningrad's
just
fragile
stack a
peace to be
Sarah
upended
booze that I'm
very
amassing.
quickly. As we speak, the nations
Yeah,
of NATO,
you're
particularly in
actually
the
gonna
eastern
be
half of the
put
European
on
continent,
booze forever.
widely expect Russia to be ready for a full-scale war with the alliance by or before the end of this decade. Some estimates place the date by which Russia might consider a probing capture of NATO territory to gauge a potential response as soon as 2027. If that happens, whenever it happens, it'll place Kaliningrad back at the same spot it was in around early 2022, a pawn in geopolitical machinations that could very well lead to major war. Over the course of the Ukraine war, Kaliningrad has not been immune from attention around its potential military role. In October 2023, the undersea pipeline we mentioned earlier, the Baltic Connector, was indeed damaged in a suspected sabotage attack that just so happened to come as the world was distracted by Hamas's October 7th attacks in Israel just one day
we'll
prior.
gamble on this
In that
side. I
incident,
normally
the
nuke
pipeline
myself
and
by
a nearby
accident.
telecoms cable were significantly damaged in an act that investigators later described
they
as,
are
quoting here,
faster.
mechanical, not an
You
explosion.
just
Suspicion fell
I'm
quickly
so
on the Baltic Fleet in Kaliningrad, and even though the incident has
fucking-
since been tied to a Chinese cargo ship called the New Polar Bear, which
Turned on right
allegedly
now.
dragged
Oh
its
my
anchor
God.
across where the pipeline was located in a
God.
likely intentional act,
Oh.
still heightened awareness of just how much of a
Anyway.
nuisance Baltic Sea adversaries to NATO could be.
I hate when that
And
happens.
in the event of a future conflict, all those prospects we discussed previously around the Kaliningrad military forces are still on the table.
Owie.
That includes everything, from an occupation of now NATO-allied Gotland to sabotage around the Baltic Rim, to a potential delaying military defense while Russia takes other NATO nations, to even a direct attack to the strip of Polish and Lithuanian land roughly 40 miles long that divides Kaliningrad from Russia's close ally Belarus. As long as Kaliningrad sits on its own little slice of Atlantic coast, it will remain a military
Blaze, do you wanna join
inevitability in any potential Russian
wanna come
NATO
steal my
conflict,
fang
no matter
job from
how
me?
disinterested the actual residents of Kaliningrad may be in the prospect of war. Yet there's also reason to believe that Kaliningrad's wartime potency may be reduced in the coming years. The 11th Army Corps, a long-time fixture of Kaliningrad's ground
Cut the
assets,
reset.
was dispatched to Ukraine under Colonel Ivan Popov,
enough.
where the 12,000-strong corps was gutted by October of that year. It's estimated to have been nearly completely destroyed, used up as cannon fodder, and taking with it
Alright.
the 100 or so main battle tanks and several hundred fighting vehicles and rocket launchers that had previously protected Kaliningrad. As of 2024, the Corps is still believed to be fighting Ukraine, with no replacement ground troops shifted in to compensate for Kaliningrad's exposure. On the other hand, Russia's air and naval assets in the exclave have been far luckier, generally avoiding the shift to Ukraine so far. Although several of the exclave's large landing ships have been sent to the Black Sea Fleet, and at least one, the Minsk, was severely damaged in 2023, it's still believed to have its cruisers, its corvettes, and enough landing craft to
congrats.
overwhelm, say, 350 ill-equipped Swedes stationed on Gotland. Its air assets are largely thought to be intact, and while it's
Oh,
expected to
well,
lose
Rex,
some
next week,
aircraft
yeah,
and
cool.
ships in the
What
coming
the
years
hell?
as they're phased out, it may also receive several
Next minute,
Larder-class
you're at
advanced
Krill?
submarines if their construction continues as planned. As a result of its continued threat, Kaliningrad has been a primary factor in the increased militarization of nearby nations, especially Poland.
One man,
Warsaw
three
made
demons,
sure to place
94.
US-made HIMARS rocket batteries close to Kaliningrad at the start of the
I'd pay
war
to
in
watch.
Ukraine, and has kept them there while embarking on a massive
One man, 4 demons. Whoa.
expansion of its military capabilities that's included everything from artillery to warplanes to tanks. Today, with 32 fifth-generation F-35 fighter jets on order, plus 48 advanced T-50 Golden Eagle fighters from Korea, 180 incoming Korean-made Black Panther tanks, and the expected capacity to build itself 820 more of the tanks from within Poland very soon, Warsaw is in a position to steamroll Kaliningrad by itself within under a decade, while its anticipated 8 total Patriot missile batteries and its existing naval fleet should be enough to prevent Kaliningrad from doing much damage in return, barring the launch of a nuclear-armed Iskander missile. The Baltic states are not quite so formidable, but the addition of better-armed Sweden and Finland to the NATO alliance has gone a long way in ensuring that if the Russian forces in Kaliningrad did try and cause major trouble, they'd quickly be hemmed in and pinned down. As Europe continues to shift into a war-ready posture, it's likely that the strategic value of Kaliningrad to Russia will diminish in the long run rather than be elevated. As Europe rediscovers what it means to stare across a border at a dangerous and ambitious potential adversary, it's begun to disrupt the dirty little secret that enabled Kaliningrad to be such a fortress at all. Put simply, Kaliningrad has worked, and Kaliningrad can only work if the relatively limited military infrastructure there can pose a real problem to the Baltic Rim nations. And Kaliningrad can only pose a real problem to those nations if those nations have taken the same lackadaisical approach to defense that they've done over the last few decades. Now that balance has shifted, and it's proved a lot harder for Russia to expand its forces in Kaliningrad while actively fighting a ruinous war elsewhere than it's been for NATO nations to build their own capabilities during what is, to them, still a time of relative peace. There are some things about Kaliningrad's value to Russia that will not change anytime soon. It's Russia's only ice-free route to the Atlantic north of Turkey, and it's got the potential for those more minor sorts of meddling that we discussed earlier, the sabotage, the small-scale occupations, that sort of thing. But more and more, the shifting balance of power in Europe has made Kaliningrad into a strategic liability for Russia, a place that Russia is duty-bound to defend, and where there would be hell to pay among the Russian people if this relatively well-off, even prosperous part of the country were to be taken by NATO force. But as for whether Russia can actually stop that, it's far harder to say, and as NATO gets better and better at constraining Kaliningrad, the exclave will increasingly be a factor that weighs heavy on the Kremlin when considering future military action. Conduct probing attacks against NATO and lose Kaliningrad. It might ultimately be that simple. What that means for the people of Kaliningrad, the million or so Russians who live atop this strange geopolitical balancing act, is tough to say. Perhaps the exclave's vulnerability will push Russia to act sooner than later, to get ahead of a cascading series of setbacks before they become too much to bear. Or perhaps it'll be the opposite, that the prospect of a NATO-occupied Kaliningrad is a powerful enough deterrent that it may motivate Moscow to avoid future conflicts and not seek them out. We certainly hope that the latter is true, and that Kaliningrad's now reduced potency as a military stronghold might finally clear its way to becoming something else, something better for the people who live there. But in a continent that seems to imagine itself more and more each day to be on the precipice of war, the threat remains. If that war does come, then it may come sooner rather than later, and if it does come sooner than later, then it will be Kaliningrad and its people who are caught in the middle. For a span of nearly 2 decades, the nation of Vietnam was a battlefield, fought between communist-aligned North Vietnam, backed up by the Soviet Union and China, and South Vietnam, backed up by the United States and the nations of Western Europe. The Vietnam War would rank among the most devastating turning points of the entire Cold War. By the time it concluded, between 900,000 and 3 million Vietnamese people would lay dead, joined by hundreds of thousands from Cambodia, Laos, the United States, and South Korea, while those who survived would be profoundly scarred by their experience no matter where they hailed from. For the world's largest communist nations, it was a hard-fought victory. For the United States, it was humiliation. And for what had once been South Vietnam, it was the end. But in today's episode of Places, we're not going to tell the story of Vietnam at war. We're going to tell the story of Vietnam after the war. It is a saga of brutal repression and difficult reconstruction, abandonment by old allies, and reconciliation with old enemies. It's a difficult history, it's profoundly difficult, and one that leaves no part of Vietnam's dark past untouched. But it is also the story of Vietnam today, a place that has come back against impossible odds and become a nation unlike any other on Earth. It is impossible to understand post-war Vietnam without first understanding the end of the Vietnam War. Although the cascade of events that ultimately saw Vietnam reunified wouldn't end until the mid-1970s, it started all the way back in 1968, when the forces of North Vietnam launched a military offensive southward known as the Tet Offensive. Around that time, Vietnam was already in the heat of full-scale war, split in its territory between the communist and Soviet-backed North and the capitalist and US-backed South. The North Vietnamese had a powerful military, one that Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev had gone out of his way to build up. At North Vietnam's disposal were modern T-54 tanks, MiG MiG fighter aircrafts, missiles, and more, although Soviet boots on the ground were relatively rare, with only a bit over a dozen Soviet troops officially counted dead by the end of the conflict. Instead of foreign troops, the North Vietnamese military worked inside the Viet Cong, otherwise known as the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam. The Viet Cong were a massive force. While they took orders from North Vietnam, particularly the country's leader Ho Chi Minh, they weren't a part of the North Vietnamese military proper. Instead, they were primarily a guerrilla army, working to mobilize and recruit Vietnamese peasants in and around South Vietnam via a system of trails, ferrying themselves, their supplies, and even heavy weapons into the territory through the neighboring nations of Laos and Cambodia. On the American side, US troops and the South Vietnamese did their level best to stamp out the Viet Cong wherever they could be found, but in effect, they were largely putting out fires instead of accomplishing major military objectives. Just before we continue with today's video, I want to talk to you about something super important, and that is your personal data. Did you know that your information is probably out there, being bought and sold by data brokers? Pretty scary stuff, and that's where today's sponsor, and now back to today's episode. But if the Vietnam War prior to 1968 was a deadly serious game of whack-a-mole, then the Tet Offensive by the Viet Cong insurgency was enough to turn that game on its head. It was a surprise attack at a massive scale in which the Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese allies launched combined offensives against nearly every city across South Vietnam. It was a ruinous campaign, one that saw purges of pro-US or pro-South Vietnam citizens in several cities, featuring both mass executions and mass recruitment of South Vietnamese into the Viet Cong's ranks. The Tet Offensive wouldn't last forever. In fact, it proved to be unsustainable when it came to asserting territorial control, and a combination of crafty counterattacks and scorched earth warfare from the Americans was enough to push the Viet Cong out of most of South Vietnam within a year. But while the Tet Offensive went down as a military failure in the grand scheme of the war, it was a major propaganda and ideological victory for the Communist North. With such a massive shock attack coming almost entirely without warning, the United States was forced to reckon with the fact that its excursion to Vietnam wouldn't be so open and shut as Korea, or even just as strategically straightforward as the Second World War. This was a conflict that saw America fighting a multi-headed hydra in a process that's become familiar in today's world, but was still relatively new back in the late 1960s. Making matters worse, Americans could hardly recognize many of their own troops anymore, at least that's what they felt at the time. Over the course of beating back the Viet Cong, Americans had perpetrated the My Lai massacre against civilians in a small village where insurgents were suspected to have hidden, and through the use of Agent Orange, counter-guerrilla operations against civilians, the use of free fire zones, and the use of torture and assassination against suspected Viet Cong, US troops had alienated themselves from the American public. Now, not only was the US fighting what seemed like more and more an unwinnable war, but it seemed, in the eyes of its own people, as if America was becoming unrecognizable in the process. The incoming administration of President Richard Nixon would work to shift America toward a policy of disengagement from the conflict, entering into negotiations around it with the Soviet Union and normalizing relations with China, a country that the US had previously held at arm's length. Around that time, Soviet relations with China were becoming far more complicated than they'd once been, and by driving a wedge between them, Nixon could do more to stymie the global rise of communism than he could ever achieve by sending more American boys to die in Vietnam. On the front lines, America moved toward a policy of so-called Vietnamization, a process by which combat duties were gradually shifted to South Vietnamese troops, while America's aerial and naval assets, still firmly under Uncle Sam's direct authority, were called in to support as needed. But while the decision to Vietnamize the war alleviated pressure on America, it would prove to be a death knell to South Vietnam. Even at the height of American intervention, the Viet Cong's success in South Vietnam indicated a population that had far fewer qualms about the communists than the South Vietnamese would have liked. Now the relatively weak government found that it couldn't count on the support of its own people, and it was militarily ill-prepared to transition into a leading role in operations against the North. America's newfound desire for a quick peace wasn't much help. Although South Vietnam was strong-armed into accepting a peace treaty it didn't want in 1973, North Vietnam would violate the treaty and start the war back up again. South Vietnam was largely able to claw back the territories that had been captured by the North, and when Richard Nixon was forced to resign in 1974, the American president who replaced him, Gerald R. Ford, was unable to get the US legislature to agree to keeping up its prior levels of military support. Also in 1974, South Vietnam lost the Paracel Islands to the Chinese Navy, and in 1975, North Vietnam began its endgame. In a gargantuan surprise attack against a South Vietnamese province, many of the South's military assets were lost or ravaged in battle, and with South Vietnam lacking the manpower and resources to fight across a large stretch of territory at a time, the South was forced to withdraw and withdraw and withdraw into fewer and fewer reinforceable positions. Even worse, South Vietnam was ill-equipped to manage a strategic withdrawal of that kind, and retreating forces, along with civilians trying to escape the North Vietnamese advance, were slaughtered. When South Vietnam put up one last brave attempt at defense and managed to hold resolute against the North, their adversary simply went around their position, and the South couldn't offer up enough reinforcements to stop them. The South Vietnamese president at the time resigned. His replacement surrendered rather than try to fight tooth and nail for the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon, and with the knowledge that the North was coming to enact vengeance on those it considered traitors, hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese made a mass exodus from the nation. Most fled on boats and barges, although others left by air, mostly either finding their way to Thailand or being picked up by American ships off the coast. The fall of Saigon became a crowning achievement for the North Vietnamese and their communist allies abroad, and became arguably the greatest black eye that America would weather over the course of the entire Cold War. It was also, quite unsurprisingly, the end of South Vietnam. As the former nation's military, political, and intellectual classes fled en masse, its leadership was tossed aside and replaced with a puppet government, while North Vietnamese soldiers patrolled the streets and North Vietnamese secret police got to work stamping out dissent. In all, anywhere from just a hair under 1 million people on the low end to up to 3.1 million on the high end were estimated to have been killed during the war. Its pre-war population had been roughly 32 million, meaning that if the highest counts are to be believed, then nearly 1 in 10 Vietnamese had been killed over the course of the war, with unbelievable numbers wounded and a very large proportion of the population ultimately displaced. The nation that was left in the aftermath, well, it was hardly a nation at all. But it would have to stagger forward, simply because there was no other choice but to try. North and South Vietnam were officially reunified in 1976 into the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. As should probably have been expected, the unified nation bore telltale signs of which side had won its recent civil war and which which side had lost. The capital, Hanoi, was a northern city. Its flag, previously flown over North Vietnam, was now flown over the entire country. And North Vietnam's one-time sponsor, the Soviet Union, was now Vietnam's primary ally abroad. South Vietnam's former ally, the United States, had been denounced and condemned by South Vietnamese leaders for abandoning their cause prior to the fall of Saigon, and America was seething at the geopolitical shellacking that it had taken while trying to help a nation that it saw as unwilling to help itself. Between a decades-long trade embargo from Washington, a strict policy of isolation imposed by other Western nations, and the desperate need for Soviet support in reconstruction, Vietnam was well and truly isolated. As for what that meant inside Vietnam, the results were something of a mixed bag. On the one hand, South Vietnamese and American fears of massacres on the order of millions by North Vietnamese soldiers against the people of the South turned out to be unfounded. Whether because so many people had already fled, or because such a massive bloodletting was never part of the plan at all, Vietnam's treatment of its own people was, well, if perhaps not good, certainly better than expected. The Viet Cong was disbanded, thus getting rid of an organization that was responsible for somewhere around 1/3 of all civilian deaths during the war, although it probably shouldn't be a surprise that none of the organization's former members ever faced prosecution for their acts in wartime. The high-ranking members of the former South Vietnamese government were spared execution or re-education and were instead allowed to live quietly inside Vietnam. Just as one example, the South Vietnamese president who'd agreed to surrender Saigon to the north would live at his villa in isolation for 8 years, growing orchids and raising birds before he was allowed to leave for Paris and then the United States later in life. In exchange for their relative freedom, the former leaders of South Vietnam would stay largely silent in Vietnamese politics over the long term. For a time, former South Vietnamese leaders thought that they might even be able to form some sort of non-communist governing body inside the country, owing to early promises that North Vietnam was in, quote, no rush to communize the South. Over the following years, that would prove to be a bit of a lie. After reunification was complete, the Vietnamese government would oversee the reshaping of a nation into a model of proper Soviet alignment. Agriculture was collectivized, with villages organized into working groups and individual landholders losing what they previously had. Farmers were asked to join state-owned cooperatives, and when they refused to volunteer, they were assimilated via far more coercive means. In cities and towns, Vietnamese working-age adults were pushed toward heavy industry, and the nation began to develop the bedrock of a manufacturing economy that has gotten far more formidable in the years since. Business owners, or rather now former business owners, got the tougher end of the deal, stripped of their holdings and assets, and made just another worker for the party. In fact, they often got some of the worst assignments, sent to lands that was euphemistically called new economic zones. In reality, they were dangerous, heavy jungle, difficult to penetrate, and miserable to endure. Workers were expected to clear this out bit by bit before building upon them. Yet even the plight of former business owners was nothing when compared to what former military officers, former government employees, and civilian sympathizers believed to be loyal to South Vietnam were forced to endure. Instead of the mass executions that had been expected across Vietnam, these people were put into another feature of communist Vietnam that had been adopted from the Soviets: re-education camps, better known in the lands of borscht and vodka as gulags. In the months immediately following the war, some 250,000 people would be marched out of Saigon and brought to forced labor camps. Actually, we should be precise here. Many of them actually went willingly, owing to the fact that re-education was advertised as a months-long process, a sort of baptism by fire that would absolve a person of their pre-reunification sins once completed. Others were members of Vietnam's ethnic Chinese minority, the Hoa, who controlled generational wealth from Vietnam's colonial periods and were a lucrative target, as well as a convenient bogeyman for the Communist Party. In total, many estimates place the number of re-educated persons closer to 1 million, and in reality, the ordeal that detainees expected to last a season or two typically stretched for years. Upon arrival, South Vietnamese former officers and government officials surrendered their identification, their formal documentation, their uniforms, their weapons if they had any, and even personal photographs that showed them to be a part of the old regime in the South. Purged of their old identities, and thus in a spiritual sense purged of part of themselves that had once shown loyalty to another government, inmates began a long campaign of political indoctrination. This process was documented extensively, first by the Italian-born American human rights activist Ginetta Moroni, who published a landmark study in 1983 after interviewing hundreds of former detainees. First, a person would be indoctrinated via lectures by cadres of communist educators, with subject matter typically pertaining to the injustices and abuses of America, South Vietnam, and the Western global order, while extolling the virtues and the generosity of the new pan-Vietnamese state. Then, after months of lectures, detainees were expected to foster group discussions that would ultimately see them self-confess past crimes. As independent outlet Vietnamese described in a 2023 article, quoting here, for example, male clerks were told they were guilty of contributing to the puppet's war machine. Inmates were forced to write very detailed autobiographies about their lives, including details about their fathers' and grandfathers' generations, as well as their material assets. Inmates were encouraged to criticize each other's confessions, and the more confessions they wrote, the better. Those confessions would then be used to justify detainees' internment in the first place, while helping to identify other so-called collaborators who were typically rounded up and brought into similar camps. But the ordeal people experienced in these camps, it didn't stop with re-education. Like its parallel in the Soviet Union, Vietnam's gulags thrived on their imposition of mandatory physical labor, wearing down detainees' bodies and refusing to provide them with adequate food or medical care. Forced to work in long shifts and meet quotas on penalty of solitary confinement, many detainees' bodies would break while trying to do what the regime asked of them, while the rest were brought to the brink of starvation and complete collapse in overcrowded, windowless barracks reminiscent of those found in Nazi concentration camps. While former soldiers accustomed to years of war in Vietnam's brutal conditions may have been equipped to survive, others almost certainly weren't. Those were the poets, the journalists, the religious leaders, and the activists who were rounded up and sent to the camps on suspicion of dissent. The doctors forced into the camps as punishment for having treated wounded South Vietnamese soldiers, and the people who were named by others who had already been taken to the camps before them. In principle, the camps took on an almost mystic quality among supporters of the Vietnamese government, a sort of state-sponsored baptism that saw those who entered be physically and spiritually transformed into a proper citizen. In terms of its pragmatic value, the camp system was meant to isolate and destroy people who might otherwise have become a threat to the new regime, stamping them out before any security risk could emerge and punishing what it derided as war criminals, largely meaning anybody who'd fought against the North. In practice, though, they were little more than torture camps where people were exposed not only to near-fatal conditions on a daily basis, but punishments such as being tied into forced contortions, shackled in solitary confinement in dark cells, or forced into tiny cargo containers with other prisoners, beaten to death or at times executed outright was common. Tuberculosis, also common. Malaria, rampant. Dysentery, unavoidable. And often, sickness was punished as a symptom of a broader, unforgivable laziness. Those who were released often got out because of simple bribery, while others were able to get out after reaching basically arbitrary thresholds in what was supposed to be a merit system. For up to a year following their release, ex-detainees were forced to live without rations, visas, access to the school system for their children, or even legal recognition as people. Those who chose to stay in Vietnam after that, instead of fleeing, were forever changed by what they had experienced. All the while, other forms of social control began to seep through Vietnamese society. Religious institutions and schools were placed under government authority. The media that had remained after reunification was tightly regulated, and organizations that were considered to be a threat to communism were shut down outright. Book burnings were common, and educators who had lived and worked in South Vietnam were frequently replaced with Northerners. The attendance of religious services was something the government began keeping close tabs on, especially attendance of Christian services, which were derided as a lingering sign of colonial rule. Disparagements of the party, of Ho Chi Minh, or of communism itself would very quickly get a person slapped with the label of reactionary, for which punishments could range greatly depending on both the specific offense and the enforcer. For years, a person's lot in life and their families' lots in life were dictated by their relation to the war, with South Vietnamese who'd fought or worked on behalf of the North during wartime being rewarded handsomely with work or education, and those who'd been faithful to the South, including up to an estimated 1/3 of the population, disadvantaged in their opportunities, work assignments, and daily interactions in their communities. Cities like Saigon were slowly depopulated, and their former residents deurbanized, encouraged to return to their hometowns, or forcibly relocated to the highlands with instructions to grow crops, but no guidance or means to do so. And while the re-education camp detainees in Vietnam had it worst of all, and many parts of the Vietnamese population had it especially bad, the entire country would be racked with death and destruction in the immediate post-war years. The national restructuring campaign had been conducted with the intent that each of Vietnam's provinces would be self-sufficient, something that the government chose to enforce almost immediately by criminalizing the transfer of food and other supplies from one province to another. But rather than successfully forcing each province to create its own resources from thin air, this almost immediately led to severe shortages across the country at exactly the wrong time for what came next. At the same time, Vietnam instituted a quota system that automatically claimed food that families had grown but didn't need for their own subsistence, basically removing any incentives to work and produce any more food than that. As food began to run out in many regions, the nation was hit by a long drought that devastated production, followed immediately by storms and cyclones that made for an exceptional wet season. Flooding wiped out rice crops in the critical Mekong Delta and sent the entire nation spiraling towards famine. By the end of the 1970s, the socialist experiment in Vietnam was spiraling toward imminent catastrophe. In 1980, Colombian writer and Nobel Prize winner Gabriel Garcia Marquez traveled to the nation's capital of Hanoi and spoke of what he saw there. And the results, predictably, were tragic. Quoting here, "Civilian airports were full of the shells of bombed warplanes and helicopters, and all manner of scrapped death machinery abandoned in the final stampede. From the deserted highways, one could see the ashes of towns wiped off the map by napalm, and the no man's land that once had been jungle, now sterilized by chemical defoliants. The irrigation canals that gave the country the look of a huge chessboard from the air were barely being put to use again." The quote ends. Garcia Marquez told of a countryside littered with mines and unexploded bombs that had claimed thousands of lives since the end of the war, and devastation to much of the farmland that might have gotten Vietnam out of its near-famine conditions. Remarking on the climate catastrophes that followed afterwards, quoting again, "God completed the Holocaust the Yankees had left unfinished. The consequences were a country leveled and 53 million human beings reduced to misery." The quote ends. All the while, life continued in Saigon. Garcia Marquez was well accustomed to the way things were in the north, where even government officials rode around on bicycles, most people didn't have or seemed to want cars, and cities and towns went quiet after about 6 in the evening, after which time families would settle in for their nightly 4-hour shifts of government television programming. Meanwhile, Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, was a bustling metropolis dominated by black markets and automobiles, with a young population that still seemed to imagine itself in European fashion. It was a place that seemed as if it had failed completely to reconcile the ruin of war, the hardship and hard realities of unified Vietnam, and the lost and broken dreams that had been dashed to bits in the aftermath of reunification. He wrote, "The cost of this delirium was stupefying. 360,000 people mutilated, 1 million widows, 500,000 prostitutes, 500,000 drug addicts, 1 million tuberculosis, and more than 1 million soldiers of the old regime impossible to rehabilitate into a new society. 10% of the population of Ho Chi Minh City was suffering from serious venereal diseases when the war ended, and there were 4 million illiterates throughout the South." Yet, Garcia Marquez wrote, swarms of homeless children bearing strange tattoos on their skin intermingled with people soon to become refugees in faraway lands, as a class of people who had once anticipated that they'd make modern, Western-style lives in Vietnam were left clutching at straws with little ability to reconcile what had happened. But although a reunified Vietnam began to crumble nearly as soon as it superglued itself back into the battered husk of a single nation, it was still under the protection of a very powerful global player, the Soviet Union. Like every other country during the Cold War, the choice between allying with the Soviets and allying with the Americans was a mutually exclusive one, with both options bringing their own fair share of risks, rewards, and inevitable turmoil and meddling from the other side. Frankly, even though this was a time in history where both the Soviet and American spheres extolled the value of certain countries and disdained others, the broader truth is that this was a very difficult time to be anything but a global superpower, and for Vietnam, the reality was no different. Like other countries in similar positions, Vietnam was forced to realize fairly early on that no matter how hard it tried to carry the flag of Soviet-style communism, it would always be a client of the Soviet Union, never a colleague. Even during the Vietnam War, a clear proxy conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, North Vietnam had never received quite the amount of support from its backer that South Vietnam had. And while the MiG and Ilyushin aircraft certainly counted for something, they never made up for a conflict where North Vietnam had to make up for its technological disadvantage by sacrificing the lives of its people. In Vietnam's later conflicts, which we'll speak about shortly, the Soviets hardly lifted a finger to fight in their client state's defense, instead sending only supplies and logistical support. But the reasons for this stem from the true value that Vietnam conferred upon the Soviets. Sure, the fact that a communist faction had forced the Americans out of a divided nation was great. In fact, it was a tremendous victory for the Soviets to take with them for the rest of the Cold War. But by the late 1970s, America wasn't really active in this part of the world, and the new threat the Soviet Union was dealing with was China. Although the two nations had once been close, China by this time was far from the lackey it had once been, and between its physical proximity to the Soviet Union and its immense manpower, it was a nation that put the Soviets in a difficult position. The Russian bear couldn't be overtaken by the Chinese dragon. That simply wouldn't do. But China had swollen to a size and power that it no longer made sense for the Soviets to assert dominance directly. Vietnam, between its shared land border with China and its ability to cause trouble across the South China Sea, was an ideal candidate to make problems for Beijing. In essence, it was the perfect partner to participate in a proxy war, and after what communist Vietnam had done against the Americans, there could be little doubt that the smaller nation could draw China into a similarly ruinous quagmire. As it turns out, Vietnam became a target of foreign attacks before it ever became an offensive actor, but the first local war to ravage Vietnam actually wasn't fought directly against China. Instead, China had its own proxy in the region, Cambodia, where the Khmer Rouge communist movement under the leadership of Pol Pot had lost its taste for cooperation with the Vietnamese communists around 1974 and 75. Initially trained by the Vietnamese and regarded as close allies, the Khmer Rouge now feared that Vietnam might try to expand beyond its own borders, and in 1977, they launched a massive surprise attack on Vietnam in an attempt to preempt potential acts of aggression. This took Vietnam by surprise, and after repelling the initial offensive, Vietnam launched a counter-offensive toward the end of the year, ultimately wrapping it up by January of 1978. China would initially attempt to mediate the conflict, but over time, it had become clear to Vietnam that China had closer relations with Cambodia than it was willing to develop with the Vietnamese. At the end of 1978, a massive force of 150,000 Vietnamese troops overran Cambodia, expelling Pol Pot from his position of power and putting an end to a ruinous few years in which up to a quarter of all Cambodians had been wiped out in Pol Pot's genocide there. Vietnam would ultimately occupy Cambodia for about 10 years, although the Khmer Rouge continued to govern from exile, and a range of resistance organizations fought against the Vietnamese in the countryside. Now, it was Vietnam, bogged down in a long foreign war, trying to stomp out a counterinsurgency that not only China, but even Great Britain was playing an active role in. Retrospectively, Vietnam's anti-insurgent actions in Cambodia have drawn close comparisons to what American soldiers experienced in Vietnam just a few years earlier, in sentiments echoed by Vietnamese survivors even today. Said one former soldier recounting his experiences to the BBC after writing a book that would ultimately be banned in Vietnam, quoting him here, "When your companions die in battle, it is a very great loss. During the war, the battle does not stop. We have no time to reflect. We must be strong to continue." Later, more than 30 years later, memories come back over and over again. The injury in the body is not so heavy, but our injury was mental. Many soldiers, 1 or 2 years later, when they came back, they went mad. The quote ends. It was an experience straight out of American memoirs of their war in Vietnam, along with a wide range of other similar conflicts that popped up on all sides of the Cold War. The Cambodian intervention would prove unpopular in Vietnam and give the country the same black eye it had given to the Americans just prior, a shared experience that would eventually give Vietnam reason to seek reconciliation with the United States in the decades afterwards. As American veterans long suspected would be the case among the Vietnamese population they subjugated, Vietnam and its role in the war is still despised across much of Cambodia even today. But the real devastation came in 1979 when, with their proxy force defeated, China decided to take its problems into its own hands. The resulting conflict would last just short of 4 weeks, mainly contained the borderlands between southern China and northern Vietnam. But the results would be devastating. China regarded Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia as an unforgivable act of expansionist or even hegemonic aggression, one that brought it from a posture of previously not really caring about Cambodia one way or the other to now regarding it as a place that simply had to be defended in order to get Vietnam to back down. As Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping explained China's plans to American President Jimmy Carter at the end of January 1979, quoting here, "This child is getting naughty. It is time he got spanked." 3 weeks after those words were uttered, China would begin its retaliatory action. With its 1.5 million troops along the northern Soviet border, ready to defend a potential counterattack from Vietnam's main backer, a force of 200,000 troops, according to China, or 600,000 according to Vietnam, marched in a southward advance. They brought with them an inferior military force with less training and less experience than the battle-hardened and well-equipped Vietnamese, but nonetheless, they were able to achieve major combat action. The Soviets never intervened militarily, and while the hundreds of tanks and artillery that they sent to Vietnam were of some help, they simply didn't see a point in engaging in battle directly. China had promised the Soviets, as well as the Americans, that they were looking to engage in only a limited war, and with China holding off on using its Navy and Air Force, this proved to be true. From a territorial perspective, China would claim only a few cities and towns before withdrawing, but the human devastation in the meantime was stunning. Casualty counts have never been truly established, with each side working to inflate the other's losses while minimizing their own, but generally, China is estimated to have lost somewhere in the realm of 6,000 to 25,000 troops. Vietnam has never acknowledged how many casualties it sustained, but Chinese estimates suggest numbers as high as 57,000 soldiers and 70,000 militia members, although those numbers are generally not regarded to be reliable. Western estimates run around 25,000 to 35,000 killed on the Vietnamese side. Again, these casualties on both sides were inflicted in a brief border war lasting fewer than 4 weeks, with repercussions that would echo across the region for decades afterward. After the wars, Vietnam would prop up a puppet regime inside Cambodia for years, effectively granting Vietnam decision-making power in the country and making it the only other nation in East Asia other than China that was able to engage in any level of regional hegemony at this time. But as a result, Vietnam's time in Cambodia quickly became yet another proxy war, this one fought with China, as China attempted to play on divisions inside Vietnam, run a counterinsurgency in Cambodia, and make the most of Vietnamese crackdowns against their Chinese minority in the north. Vietnam responded with increased hostility toward other nations nearby, including against Thailand and Singapore, driving those nations toward China in the long term. As Vietnam lost prestige and credibility and began to be perceived more and more as a purely malevolent actor, its role in Asia became more and more limited until, for all intents and purposes, it was reduced to a Soviet vassal state. Former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger once opined that it was actually the failure of the Soviet Union's Vietnam experiment that led the superpower to engage in what would become a fruitless campaign in Afghanistan. The following decade, Vietnam would become increasingly economically dependent on the Soviet Union, receiving immense amounts of economic aid by the late 1980s. In fact, it was rivaled only by Cuba and Mongolia, who, together with Vietnam, amounted for over 90% of Soviet economic aid around the world. But at the same time, the 1980s would see the Soviets become disillusioned with Vietnam for reasons beyond just the country's inability to be a counterweight against China. More troubling was the degree to which the Soviets felt that the aid they sent was being misused. The Soviets had hoped for a far greater level of economic progress in Vietnam than had been achieved by that time, and corruption and naive mismanagement were all too common. Strangely enough, very little of the wealth the Soviets had funneled to Vietnam seemed to translate into fixes for unemployment or malnutrition, and the nation's agricultural practices remained significantly less developed than it perhaps should have been. Over the years, these problems got worse, not better, to the point that by 1988, crop shortages in several northern provinces were at near crisis levels. But all across the decade, the Soviets found greater utility in working with Vietnam despite its imperfections than they found in the idea of abandoning their last true ally in East Asia, and Vietnam, after isolating itself from the global West and the Far East alike, had nowhere else to turn. The other side of Vietnam's place on the global stage at this time was its intense isolation from any nation that considered itself even marginally aligned with the United States. The post-war years had not been kind to Vietnam-US relations, understandably so. After a decade out for each other's throats, the governments of the two countries had little reason to work together. Early after the war ended, Vietnam tried to normalize its relations with the US again and obtained $3.3 billion in reconstruction aid that Richard Nixon had promised Vietnam in secret, while the nation worked hard to entice American oil companies to enter into arrangements with Vietnam to search for oil offshore. But in such an intense environment as post-war America, the idea of reparations payments to Vietnam were a non-starter. And the country's affiliations with the Soviet Union made it an adversary for the long term. The US, Europe, and other allied nations imposed a comprehensive trade embargo, one that only got broader in scale the more Vietnam insisted that it be provided economic assistance for a post-war recovery. The US was far more concerned with accepting Vietnamese refugees who'd been on their side of the war than aiding a people many Americans still considered to be the enemy. And when Vietnam found itself at war with an adversary in China that the US was working hard to build relations with, they'd seen enough. All through the 1980s, Vietnam was barred from normalization efforts with the United States, with even America's basic openness to the concept now predicated on Vietnam ending its occupation in Cambodia. The whereabouts of American soldiers missing in action was another massive sore spot, with well over 1,000 soldiers still unaccounted for in the early 2000s. Attempts by Vietnam to solicit US partnership by cooperating with American demands proved to be fruitless, leading to such frustration inside Vietnam that eventually the country reverted to its immediate post-war posture, a set of policies that mostly involved sticking up two middle fingers to the Americans and insisting that the issue of missing soldiers could only be addressed once Vietnam began to receive American aid payments. It wasn't until 1987 that even the slightest breakthroughs could be reached, and it would be nearly another decade after that before the two sides finally began to discuss what it would take to move forward. Through the 1970s and the 1980s, Vietnam wasn't just an isolated nation, and it wasn't just a nation that found itself at war far too often. It was also a nation in which massive swaths of the population still struggled to live under the same flag, let alone in the same towns and villages. Remember, even though the North had won, it had isolated, persecuted, and even brainwashed many of the people who had taken up arms against it. The entirety of South Vietnam, not just its soldiers, had watched with trepidation as the Vietnam War came to a close. In the aftermath, even those who hadn't fought directly were often reticent to play the games of the communists, and resistance across the nation was commonplace. For people who still lived in South Vietnam's countryside and had no intention to leave, they were often directed to become part of rural collectives. There, they didn't have much power, but they had some. And to the extent that they could be a thorn in the side of the regime without getting themselves sent off to a Vietnamese gulag, well, they did so. Vietnam's struggles with food production were, in part, economic. After all, why work so hard to produce food when everything you and your family didn't immediately need to eat would simply be taken away from you without compensation? The refusal to produce more food than necessary was also an act of resistance. Producing for the collective was a secondary priority, and if a person could produce enough for themselves and their families, squirreling away a little surplus so they didn't have to rely on the collective, then they could withhold the value of their labor from the collective at will. So too would they delay deliveries of crops and livestock, and as time went on, the tactics became less a tool of individual families and more of entire collectives who were slowly growing disillusioned with the regime. The tactics would spread northward after a time and become indispensable, even in North Vietnam, among farmers who were less than amenable to what their regime had become. Then there were the people of Vietnam who had no intention of staying, the boat people. Many of the boat people were part of the ethnic Chinese Hoa population who, as we previously mentioned, were a wealthy minority group in South Vietnam before the end of the war. Many of them had lived comfortably in a district of Saigon called Cho Lon, translated to Big Market, a place known for its brothels, opium dens, and extravagant wealth relative to the rest of Vietnam. Immediately after the fall of Saigon, many people there had fled while they had a chance, but others opted to make what would eventually turn out to be a major miscalculation. Taking advantage of the chaos after the war, imported goods and precious metals and gems were stockpiled in Cholon, parlayed into control of a black market that ran illicit distribution of food across the rest of Vietnam. In the short term, this made Vietnam's post-war struggles a profitable affair, but by 1978, the whole thing was dismantled. Between the He status as a minority group and their ties to capitalist systems in a nation now completely ruled by communists, they were the perfect scapegoat for the government, and after private business was nationalized and Vietnam found itself in conflict with China, the He saw the writing on the wall. With China now Vietnam's main antagonist, the He practically guaranteed to be Chinese spies in the eyes of many other Vietnamese. But it was time to get out. We've already mentioned the writings of Colombian Nobel laureate Gabriela Garcia Marquez, who visited Vietnam in 1980. By the time he arrived, incredible numbers of people were leaving Saigon each month, including well over 50,000 in May and June of 1979. Word of successful escapes to Thailand, Indonesia, and Hong Kong began to pour back into Vietnam, inspiring more and more people to take the chance to flee, either unaware of the fact that those who'd perished on the voyage weren't alive to warn them against it, or trying to block out that reality as best they could in an attempt to coax themselves into making the leap anyway. Technically speaking, there was a legal path to refugee departure via the UN, but because that process demanded resident visas for people looking to travel to a new place, it was functionally useless. Instead, amidst desperation and growing poverty, South Vietnam became a mad dash toward the exit. Wrote Garcia Marquez during his travels, "The most expensive medicine in Vietnam last August were pills for seasickness. The drugstores, where it usually cost a little over $1 for 12 pills, were out of them, and they began to show up on the black market at $5 a piece. Still, they weren't the most expensive necessity or the most difficult to obtain in order to flee Vietnam on board an illegal boat. In Ho Chi Minh City, formerly Saigon, anybody who wanted to leave could do so whenever he wanted to if he had enough money to pay the price and was ready to assume the enormous risk." Garcia Marquez shared stories with the world of seeing Vietnamese people struggle to scrounge up pure gold in order to finance their escape. 3.5 ounces per head for anyone aged 6 to 16, and 6 ounces a head for adults, plus another 5 ounces to pay off local officials along the journey. Much of their gold was left over from the financial endeavors of the immediate post-war years, now given up as a sort of forced atonement for those same endeavors now that the Hoa and other South Vietnamese were forced to leave. Those who could afford the trip piled onto rickety boats equipped with little other than the clothes on their backs. The boats they boarded were fishing vessels packed with several hundred people, despite being designed for 100 or less, and manned by people who often had little idea what they were doing in the best of times, let alone how to respond to any crisis. A large proportion of those on board were under the age of 12, some traveling with their parents and some sent by their parents in order to find a life that those same parents knew they'd never see. And during the voyages that these ships attempted to carry out, there was no shortage of crises to fear. Weather off the Vietnamese coast was unreliable at best and outright fatal at worst, with frequent storms, high waves, and waters well populated with creatures that would be more than happy to claim a human snack. On board, standing water could lead to the spread of disease, to cause the boat to drag even lower in the water, raising the risk that it would capsize when poor conditions came along. When ships began to sink, they were often ignored by the vessels, who overlooked a fundamental maritime expectation that ships help ships in need, no matter the circumstances. The Vietnamese Navy prowled the waters, not always effectively, but more than enough to give refugees reason to fear. And worst of all, were the pirates, often from Cambodia or Thailand, and sometimes from China, all looking to rob refugees of their belongings, abduct and attack women, and, if the refugees were particularly unlucky, sink their boats. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, in the year of 1981, refugee boats were attacked on average 3 times each, with 228 women abducted and 881 people dead or missing in that year alone. It would take almost a decade for the pirate scourge to be brought under control, and in all, the UNHCR estimates that up to 600,000 people might have died fleeing Vietnam by sea. Some figures suggest that just 10% of boat people died on the water. Other figures are as high as a staggering 70%. When people arrived to new nations, the reception they got was as variable as it was potentially dangerous. Malaysia had vowed that it would use devastating naval force to destroy refugee ships that approached its coastal waters, setting upon them with machine guns rather than allowing them to reach land. Those who did get caught often weren't gunned down in practice, but were towed to massive refugee camps, particularly Bedong Island. The island was less than a square mile in land area, but ultimately became home to over 40,000 refugees at its peak, with no on-island source of food and water, and no sanitation infrastructure. Indonesia was somewhat less interested in bloodshed, but relied on its own refugee camps too, with Galang camp hosting some 250,000 refugees in the years that it was open. In Thailand, the plight of the boat people turned into a worldwide news story, with the Thai government declaring within a year or two that it was overwhelmed with the sheer number of fugitives coming in, many of whom were actually from Laos, but all of whom were counted in Thailand as Vietnamese. The Philippines received many others, and Hong Kong took in a large portion as well. The degree to which the boat people became an international symbol of Vietnamese tyranny and repression seemed to surprise the Vietnamese government as it was happening. The country, to their credit, hadn't told any of those people to leave, and by its own understanding of its internal politics, it hadn't even put any of them at unjustifiable risk, despite its suspicions that they lacked loyalty to Vietnam. Whether or not that is actually true in a country ravaged by re-education camps and forced relocations, that's another matter. But to Vietnam's leaders, it was a major shock. International solidarity around the Vietnamese government was replaced by international solidarity against the Vietnamese government, and with the exodus of some of Vietnam's best educated professionals and wealthiest citizens, left much of the economic power and the technical prowess that would have been critical in attempts to rebuild simply gone. Once the boat people really began departing in force, Vietnam found itself deep in a morass that it had hoped to avoid. The occupation of Cambodia would prove to be a painful and slow exercise in attrition. The national economy would continue to sputter toward an agonizing death, and the international community no longer had any interest in taking pity on a country it saw as having forced out immense numbers of its own people. Vietnam was alone in a grinding cycle of deterioration that it lacked the power, and seemingly even the political and party will, to stop. For a nation so deeply intertwined with the Soviet Union, it should be no surprise that the ebb and flow of Soviet culture had ripple effects within its southeastern ally. When the Soviets got bogged down in Afghanistan, Vietnam was bogged down in Cambodia. When the Soviet economy engine began to falter, Vietnam's was barely functioning. But when the Soviet Union got a reformer, the people of Vietnam had little choice but to perk up their heads and observe the change happening beyond their borders. The reformer was Mikhail Gorbachev, a man who was less than kind in his assessment of Vietnam. According to him, the country, along with other so-called socialist camp nations, was a weight dragging on the ankles of the Soviet Union, taking far more than it provided to the Soviets in return. As Gorbachev saw it, the Soviets' continued attempts to keep Vietnam afloat were stupid. The Soviet grudge against China was stupid, and the Soviet Union's seeming disdain for the Pacific Rim, of which it was very much a part, was stupid too. Gorbachev's new Soviet Union would live by two rules: glasnost, or openness, in the hopes that freedom of speech and press could be introduced and broadened, and perestroika, the progressive restructuring of the Soviet economy and political system away from extreme centralization and toward greater efficiency, no matter where that efficiency came from. In Vietnam, the concept of openness, glasnost, was taken with a bit more hesitation than it was in the Soviet Union. While the idea of cracking down on corruption via public arrests and laying out the realities of economic mismanagement for the Vietnamese population weren't out of the question, the Vietnamese Communist Party had considerably more trouble with other parts of the policy that seemed to come so naturally to Gorbachev. The media was still tightly constricted in what it could say or do. Criticism of the high ideals of communism was still a grave offense, and the West was still the great enemy. But nonetheless, perestroika, restructuring, seemed to come a little bit easier. In Vietnam, the concept was referred to as doi moi, a term that in Vietnamese relates to concepts of rebirth and rejuvenation more generally. The economy began to open somewhat, with capitalist principles slowly trickling in and resulting in a hesitant acceptance of some elements of private enterprise. Vietnam found its way to cultivating a business class, which, conveniently enough, seemed to share a lot of members in common with the communist elite. The changes were couched in moderating statements and caveats by party officials, including this one from a prominent economic thinker in Vietnam, quoting here, "We are using capitalists to improve our economy. Marxism is against exploitation, not against being rich. Sometimes we misunderstand Marxism. That there will be no rich people, that everyone will be equal, can only happen in the advanced phase of capitalism. In the meantime, we have to put up with people being rich because they are talented and have a good mind. And as Vietnam began to carefully start engaging with other capitalist concepts, like starting up private enterprises and letting them conduct international business, the government's attempts to reconcile Marx and Lenin with their new economic way didn't start to wane as time went on. Instead, the Vietnamese government chose to double down in a way that Soviet Russia never did, weaving the two concepts together in an attempt to prove that they weren't necessarily opposed. Under Vietnam's vision for its economic future, the nation would endeavor to become a so-called socialist-oriented market economy. That is to say, an economy that was, in practice, ultimately capitalist, but kept fidelity to Marxist-Leninist ideals in principle. In Vietnam's economy, private, collectivist, and state-owned enterprises are meant to work together, with state and collectivist endeavors forming the fundamental structure that keeps the economy afloat, and private enterprise basically working on the fringes. As it turned out, that model worked really well. The government was able to take unilateral action when it needed to in order to keep the economy afloat and growing, and the private sector was let off its leash in order to do what it did best, namely to make money. Under that model, the Vietnamese Communist Party could continue to exist, it could continue to issue 5-year economic plans, and it could continue to aspire toward a later stage economy more in line with truly socialist ideals. But it could also function exceedingly well in today's world as compared to other developing nations. The results were striking for Vietnam. During the 1990s, export volume increased year over year by 20 to 30%, even sustaining through the economic crisis that rocked Asia during the latter half of the decade. Manufacturing played a dominant role, although Vietnam was also able to become a major food exporter in due time. By the end of the 20th century, over 30,000 private businesses were thriving in Vietnam. Poverty rates had been halved since their pre-reform numbers, and nearly half of the national GDP was made up of exports. The country implemented a policy around birth rates, but a two-child policy rather than the one-child policy of neighboring China, and it remained strict about asserting government control over some areas while picking and choosing the areas where the private sector could best serve the country by operating as it saw fit. With Vietnamese economic reform at home came the first early signs that the nation's relations with the USA might start to defrost. In 1987, Vietnam managed to secure an agreement with the United States that while America wouldn't send economic aid or pay for war damages directly, they'd encourage that charitable organizations work to assist Vietnam in addressing its national plight. In exchange, the Americans got increased cooperation with the issue of missing soldiers. Over the following few years, Vietnam and the US began to get a bit cozier around the negotiating table. Certainly not to the point of a true collaboration, but at least to the extent that they were able to work together productively. As the pain and devastation of the Vietnam War began to fade into memory in the American consciousness, and the big, scary Soviet Union started to look like it was losing its teeth and claws, the prospect of negotiating with Vietnam, or even working toward true mutual aims, became far less of a taboo in Washington, and much more of a real possibility. The tipping point came in the early 1990s, during the Clinton years in America, when 2 US senators, a Republican named John McCain and a Democrat named John Kerry, started to prod Clinton about reopening relations. Both men were veterans of the Vietnam War and served on the Congressional Commission to address prisoners of war and missing US troops. McCain had had close brushes with death multiple times, even being tortured and left permanently disabled by the North Vietnamese as a prisoner of war for several years, and had been awarded high honors like the Silver Star Medal, 3 Bronze Stars, and the Distinguished Flying Cross. Kerry, too, had been wounded in combat 3 times by the Viet Cong and was awarded a Silver Star and a Bronze Star with Valor. We take the time to emphasize their service because not only were these 2 high-ranking American officials with supreme credibility on matters relating to the Vietnam War, but they were men who had experienced more pain at the hands of their Vietnamese adversaries than any person should ever have to. Over the 1980s, they'd frequently visited Vietnam and worked with Vietnamese officials, and during the Clinton presidency, both men met together with the president many times to persuade him to lift the embargo. Not only did they make a persuasive case in strategic and economic terms, but their support, couched in their credibility on the subject, was enough to create a broad consensus in America that it was time to move on from the hurt and the pain of Vietnam. After all, if these 2 could do it, then Americans who'd never served had little right to remain stuck in the mud. With the rusty gears of diplomacy finally lubricated, America and Vietnam began churning their way toward reconciliation. The American embargo on Vietnam was lifted in February 1994, with formal normalization commencing in 1995, and both countries hosting embassies on each other's soil by the end of the year. Trade between the two nations resumed in 1997, and immediately American importers seized on the manufacturing prowess that Vietnam could bring to bear. In the year 2000, the two nations signed a bilateral trade agreement, giving Vietnam even greater incentive to become the sort of manufacturing heavy export economy that America could so clearly benefit from working with. Investment poured in, not just from the States, but from other nations that had previously been disinterested in working with Vietnam. It wasn't all smooth sailing. The endemic corruption there was a blinking red light in the international community's eyes, and some doubted whether the nation's incredible economic boom would prove sustainable at all. But history has showed that Vietnam's rise was no accident, and that its unique take on reconciliation, not just with the West, but within its own economic and geopolitical model, were the critical pieces that got it to where it is today. While Vietnam certainly isn't perfect, but it bears little resemblance to the poor, desperate, and hungry nation that it once was. The national transition toward manufacturing meant that former city dwellers could return to where they'd once lived, while overstressed and undernourished land could begin to recover. The Vietnamese government, once stretched every which way to manage every element of a crisis that was spiraling out of control, could now be far more precise about how it managed and even prevented problems in certain regions. The introduction of real market incentives to productivity meant that farmers now had good reason to produce more than they needed to survive, and Vietnam's agricultural sector surged back to life in a way that meant even when droughts or floods did sweep the landscape, they were far less catastrophic than they used to be. More wealth pouring into the country led to the ability to support more robust health and education infrastructures. Communities were able to use their own money to build back from devastation and address local issues without the need for government oversight. And many of the people who had left Vietnam long ago could return home or see their families for the first time in more than a decade. And through it all, Vietnam's Communist Party didn't topple like it did across the remnants of the Soviet Union. Instead, the nation was able to keep faithful to the broad concept of Marxism, and that communist ethos still runs through Vietnam today in a way that proved impossible in Eastern Europe and most parts of the Soviet Union. Vietnam is one of the few nations left on Earth that still boasts hammer and sickle imagery. It's run by way of a National Congress held once every 5 years, and the policies and decisions made by the National Congress are carried out by a central committee, a secretariat, and a politburo. The whole nation is overseen by the General Secretary of the Communist Party, an office currently held by a leader partway through his third term. The country's Central Theoretical Council works to ensure that the governing party doesn't stray too far from Marx, and in a practical sense, it's played a leading role in the complicated and often acrobatic affair of justifying Vietnam's actions within its guiding theory. According to the party, Vietnam's socialist-oriented market economy doesn't have to be capitalist simply because it's a market economy. In fact, according to Vietnam, it's not necessarily socialist either. It's the market economy Vietnam is working with. Vietnam tries to run that market economy in a way that draws on socialist principles, and that's that. As for what the economy actually looks like, well, it's booming, and it doesn't appear that the boom is going to stop anytime soon. The country is a major agricultural exporter, leveraging effective land distribution programs and pouring money into the rural communities that make the national agricultural landscape work. In addition to the country's booming manufacturing industry, it's become a major player in information technology, investing heavily into training and educational programs that have raised countless people from the circumstances they and their families faced in decades past. Vietnam's recently become a player in both high-tech industry and oil production, both of which have set off a cascading effect in which subsequent investment becomes even easier for foreign financiers to justify. The country's become a booming tourist destination, among the fastest growing in the world, and it's increasingly become a player in scientific research. All the while, the nation's success in reopening its ties to the global West have led to the adoption of many trappings of the modern world. While Vietnam remains a bicyclists' nation despite its brutal hills, cars and buses have become far more common than they used to be, with individual vehicle ownership a recent but much appreciated trend in the country. Electrical and telecommunications infrastructure has been constructed across most of the country within just a couple of decades, while clean and reliable drinking water is becoming far more accessible, owing in part to the spread of community-scale and home-by-home water filtration systems. Those improvements have gone a long way in dealing with polluted and unsanitary water across the country, although in that regard the country still has plenty of room to improve. Vietnam, in its modern era, shows reflections of both its communist history and its newfound openness to the rest of the world. The country elects a president, it has a prime minister, and both of those more Western-style officers manage to share power and responsibilities with the general secretary. Vietnam features a relatively robust judiciary, but it serves a strictly single-party political system where, although nominally different political parties like the Vietnamese Fatherland Front and the Workers' Party do exist, they all require the sign-off of the Communist Party and are expected to stay loyal to the same fundamental ideology. Internationally, it's a member of all the global and East Asian organizations one might expect, and while it's not exactly neutral like Switzerland in its posture, the nation maintains a strict policy of open multilateralism, meaning basically they'll work with most nations out there and would rather be building things up than blowing them up. With the shifting geopolitics of East Asia, Vietnam has found itself drawn closer and closer to its old enemy, the United States, linking itself into an informal but slowly strengthening network between America, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand. Not an official Asia-Pacific NATO by any stretch, but the comparison isn't that far off. Generally speaking, Vietnam's interested in seeing China's expansionist policies reined in, and the United States is glad to have another ally on board in order to support that effort. The Vietnamese military is fairly large, and the country's many, largely peaceful militias lends it substantially greater strength, although the People's Navy and the People's Air Force would be ill-equipped to face down China on their own. But while Vietnam appears quite well integrated into a generally Western geopolitical order, the situation at home there still leaves much to be desired. Although Vietnam's one-party system seems outwardly to produce less bad results than other one-party systems around the world, it's still a place where free and fair elections simply don't exist, and where the Communist Party has shown time and time again that it's glad to violate its own rules on things like term limits when it chooses to. Nobody, except for vetted political candidates, can even consider runs for office, and people who attempt to form opposition parties, which are by nature illegal, are liable to be imprisoned for their trouble. As such, political participation among the general populace is somewhere between irrelevant and farcical, and party officials have very little incentive to set government policy in line with the wishes of the people, who broadly have very few mechanisms to make those wishes known. The party is known to be rife with corruption, and while party leaders have taken a hard line against corruption in recent years, even leading to the ouster of a very recent president, the situation still leaves much to be desired. Freedom of press in Vietnam is functionally unheard of, with journalists functionally barred from conducting investigations that risk showing the Communist Party in a negative light, and commentary that critiques government policy or conduct will typically incur criminal penalties. Wide-reaching anti-speech laws empower the Vietnamese government to tightly restrict social media and blog activity among its citizens, and independent print and broadcast media essentially don't exist. International news that's deemed a threat to national security is generally not able to make it through to the people, and Vietnamese journalists and bloggers face not only arrest by the authorities, but assaults at home and disappearances when they're living abroad. Religious engagement is technically permitted, but religious organizations are expected to be supervised by the Communist Party, and unregistered and unrecognized groups are not only criminalized, but are harassed openly with property damage and outright violence against leaders and followers. When people organize in the streets, brutal police crackdowns typically follow close behind, and while a handful of non-governmental organizations do manage to get good work done in the country, most are banned or risk a very quick ouster if they're caught engaging in conduct other than what the Vietnamese government might expect of them. Lawyers are typically unwilling to engage with criminal and civil cases that might put them at odds with the government, and in general, the profession is badly overworked and fails to attract many new members each year. The Vietnamese state is known to abuse political prisoners and other detainees, and while the number of people who are executed by the state is kept secret, Vietnam's penal system is well understood to be a place where many people go and fewer come out. Unfortunately, Vietnam's problems today go far beyond just its political system. Even many decades after the end of the Vietnam War, the after effects still haunt the nation, largely courtesy of American tactics of warfighting that left a longer-lasting impact on the landscape. The legacy of Agent Orange still ripples through Vietnam in the form of birth defects, even in babies born today, and long-term health issues in the population in southern and central Vietnam. The US is in the process of helping with the cleanup, expected to take decades, while Vietnam spends the US dollar equivalent of $500 million each year in the physical recovery and financial support of victims. Even now, reforestation is not an easy process, with some areas proving particularly difficult to bring back to life, even as the Mekong Delta has been largely overrun with mangroves, as it had been before the war. Further, unexploded bombs, hidden landmines, and other lingering signs of war still dot the landscape despite international efforts from across Europe, Asia, and North America to disarm bombs and demine the nation. And beyond the repercussions of war, Vietnam faces long-term problems when it comes to human trafficking, domestic violence in families, vigilante violence among small communities in the countryside, and widespread harassment against racial and ethnic minorities. Yet with all of that said, Vietnam still has plenty of success stories to its name, success stories that, in aggregate, show that this is a country where things are far better than they used to be. Vietnam's poverty rate is now less than that of most other nations in the region, and today, fewer people there live in extreme poverty than ever. The country's standard of living has gone way up, especially in Hanoi in the north and Ho Chi Minh City, formerly known as Saigon, in the south. The Communist Party has taken pains to reduce economic inequality where possible and invest capital and resources in poor or far-flung parts of the country. Education and healthcare in the nation are quite robust overall, unemployment is very low, and GDP per capita has improved substantially every year for the last couple of decades. Life expectancy has climbed dramatically as well, with women in Vietnam now expected to live well past 80, and infant mortality has plummeted, especially in rural areas where public health services are now available. The country's urban areas are thoroughly modernized, infrastructure and resources are generally quite satisfactory, and the economy has proven to be generally recession-proof, at least for now. Today, Vietnam's quite a young nation, with the majority of people aged under 40. At the time of writing, Vietnam's right on the verge of cresting past a total population of 100 million. Split between some 54 recognized ethnic groups, but mostly the majority Viet, the nation's many peoples have proven able to share their country peacefully for the vast majority of the time. The country is still predominantly rural, with only about 1 in 3 people dwelling in the cities at the time of the last census, but the trends are headed firmly toward urbanization. Between its pleasant conditions and its economic opportunity, Ho Chi Minh City is the place expected to grow fastest, while out in the countryside, more and more people are beginning to coalesce into larger communities than the villages that were the norm across this land for centuries. In cultural celebrations, in literature, and in music, many elements of Vietnam's storied past can be felt today, although much of it is preserved alternately to build up the Communist Party's claim to authority and to draw tourists seeking what they imagine to be the real Vietnamese experience. When it comes to Vietnam's future, it's important to recognize that unlike many other parts of the world that deal with repression, that still experience the aftershocks of war, and that struggle to extend the benefits of modernity to the whole of their people, Vietnam is not a place that its people are inclined to leave. When asked by Pew Research Center in 2014, 88% of polled Vietnamese people said that they hoped their own personal futures would lead them to remain in Vietnam, as opposed to 75% in China, 65% in the Philippines, and less than 50% in other countries polled like Jordan and Egypt. In the same poll, 94% of Vietnamese expected that they'd be better off in the future than they were at that time, as opposed to just 14% in Japan and 13% in France. Many people who once fled Vietnam, or in some cases their children, are now coming back, bringing the benefits of foreign enterprise and education as they return. While the history of the Vietnam War can certainly be felt across the nation, it's nowhere near the dominant cultural memory that many foreigners, and particularly Americans, expect it would be. After all, most of Vietnam's population today wasn't even born when the war concluded, and even a person born on the day of Vietnam's reunification would have precious little memory of the violence that came after. As time goes on, it appears altogether likely that Vietnam's place in the global order will only get more important. The country aims to become a high-income nation by 2045, something it's well on its way to doing, and it's been unusually proactive compared to other countries when it comes to drawing down emissions and stopping deforestation. Its population is aging, but appears, for now, to be relatively stable. Its trade revenues aren't what they once were, but for now, they're still fairly robust. Look at Japan or South Korea at previous moments in their history, and their positions were quite similar. But where those nations now face population decline and must deal with social challenges among an increasingly elderly nation, those are examples that Vietnam can follow and learn from proactively if it chooses to do so. This is a nation that certainly has a long way left to go, with lingering issues to work through and systems in place that serve nobody except those in power. But rising from a legacy of brutal war, global isolation, and cultural despair, Vietnam has made an astonishing recovery thus far. As time goes on, there's every reason to believe that the country's national resurgence can only continue.
There is a land in Asia, quite unlike any other. For centuries, a warrior people have attempted to defend it at all costs. It has been one of the most dangerous places in the world, and at times was host to some of the most dangerous people in the world. This is a place where terrorists go to school, where an ongoing jihad over a decade long is just the latest in a series of jihads that are over a decade long. We're talking about Waziristan. Now, some of you might never have heard of it, as it is just a small section of a formerly semi-autonomous region on the Afghan border. There are so many questions that a place like Waziristan stirs up. Who are the people defending this land? Why do extremists flock to it like a moth to a flame? And how has a line on a map drawn in the 19th century led to thousands of deaths, war, and suffering? Well, you're about to find out, because this is just about everything you need to know about Waziristan. Waziristan is an area around 11,585 square kilometers, or 4,500 square miles in size. It sits on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan in the northwest of Pakistan. This border is known as the Durand Line, from back when the UK colonized India in the 19th century. Waziristan's territory roughly lies between the Gomor River in the south and the Karam River in the north. However, the entirety of Waziristan itself is also split in half administratively, creating what is known as South and North Waziristan. That's not all, though. Waziristan was originally part of the FATA, or Federally Administered Tribal Areas, in Pakistan, a semi-autonomous tribal region that existed from 1947 until 2018, when it was merged with the neighboring province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Much like its western neighbor Afghanistan, Waziristan is particularly mountainous. Hills gradually rise from the east to the west until they reach staggering peaks over 3,000 meters, that's 9,000 feet, in the southern half of the region. The northern half is less mountainous and more open, but it has large hills and vast valleys, perfect for guerrilla warfare. Having pretty hostile terrain is a double-edged sword in politics. The more rugged the landscape, the less likely you are to be successfully invaded. This is something that Afghanistan next door knows so well. However, that protection comes at a cost, and Waziristan's economic development is inhibited as a result. Open Data Pakistan tells us that maize, fruit, and wheat are the major crops, with some sugar and rice to supplement that. However, recent patterns of erratic weather, droughts, and a lack of water infrastructure or the capital to build have resulted in an agricultural downturn in recent years. 90% of Waristan's population are associated with the agricultural sector. In other words, Waziristan, as an area, has always been one of little economic development. The people there live out a meager existence, and the agricultural downturn has only made the situation worse. They are at the whims of the weather, like any substantial agricultural population.
Today's episode is brought to you by one of my favorite sponsors, and that is Vessi, who make the most fantastic shoes that you will ever wear. These are the new Courtside Classics by Vessi. Brand new pair of shoes. Just like all Vessis, they are 100% waterproof, and that's thanks to the material they're made out of called Dymatex. You can go splashing through puddles. You can basically go up to here, and your socks will remain perfectly dry. It's just water goes on and then it comes off. It's pretty amazing stuff. I've been wearing Vessis for 2-3 years now, however long I've been working with them, and I basically don't wear any other shoes because they are super comfortable, they are waterproof, you can wear them all year round, and waterproof doesn't mean like your feet are going to get sweaty. The Dynametex material that they use means that they're waterproof but still breathable somehow. It's really good. You never even notice. They're good for summer, winter, whatever time of year. Make the most of city life with vintage style comfort sneakers, the Courtside Classic. Discover more fantastic styles at vessi.com/places. Get your pair today to get an automatic 15% off your first purchase at checkout, and you'll stay cool and you will stay dry. Huge thanks to Vessi for sponsoring today's video, and now back to it.
The Pakistan Bureau of Statistics states that there is just short of 1.6 million people living in Waziristan. The majority of the tribes living there are Pashtun, meaning they speak the Pashto language, similar to their Afghani neighbors, although they do speak a specific Waziri dialect. The most populous tribe is the Wazirs, for which the area is known. There are also the Masuds, Bitanis, and Dawars, among other smaller tribes as well. Pakistan is already a highly Islamic country, and Waziristan is no different. They adhere to Sunni Islam, and specifically the Hanafi school of thought, as well as Pashtunwali, the traditional tribal code, which facilitates their society. That is to say, as Muslims go, many in Waziristan are on the conservative side of things and follow a pretty strict code in accordance with their tribal culture, bolstered by Islam. However, whilst many will know of Waziristan owed to the current war on terror and the coalition invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the people who populate Waziristan have a long and sordid history with colonists. So, let's go back a few centuries, shall we? To understand the history of Waziristan, you have to go back further than the history of Pakistan as a nation and delve into the history of India. India at the time of British colonization in the 19th century included the territories now known as the countries of Bangladesh and Pakistan. In 1806, Shah Abdulaziz Mahadith Diwali declared Dar-ul-Harb, meaning abode of war, on the British in India. He asserted in his fatwa that Muslims in then India should revolt against the British for freedom, equality, and justice. He also asserted that Muslims should be the de facto leaders of India after the British were expelled. As a result, Shah Abdulaziz is seen as one of the earliest proponents of Indian independence. Even as far back as over 200 years ago, you can see Muslims in the subcontinent willing to fight to establish self-determination. This parallel from past to present shows that the surviving remnants of Islamic fundamentalism in Waziristan today strongly link back to hundreds of years of history. It goes some of the way in explaining how this fundamentalism has defined the area for at least 2 centuries. 2 wars were fought between Britain and Afghanistan in the 19th century, owed to the geopolitical game of chess that the British Empire was playing against Russia to see who gained de facto control of Afghanistan. This geopolitical posturing continued until 1893, when Afghanistan's Abdur-Rahman Khan and Britain's Sir Henry Mortimer Durrand agreed to delineate the border between what was then Afghanistan and British India. With a few strokes of a pen, the Durrand Line was born. Much like other British lines on maps at the time, it cut directly through local villages and divided communities, which would eventually lead to disaster years down the line. Who would have known? Waziristan just happened to be just on the British India side, with the border's existence separating Pashtun families living across the line to this day. When the British entered Waziristan, they halved it into its northern and southern parts and set up administrative headquarters in Wana and Miranshah, where local command centres remain to this day, even though the British are long gone. The British also introduced a land record system and revenue administration for the region. However, peace between Afghanistan and Britain simply couldn't last, and skirmishes over the border began almost immediately, with Britain not completely restoring order until 1901. The British time in Waziristan was immensely difficult, with different mountain tribes revolting against the British on a consistent basis until 1919, when the leader of Afghanistan was assassinated. Afghani troops then crossed the border into Waziristan, and thus the Third Anglo-Afghan War began. Along with their Muslim and Pashtun brothers in Afghanistan, the tribes also rose up in rebellion. The fighting was so brutal that the British required the use of enormous firepower to reassert control over the Plucky region by 1920, and eventually stationed a permanent garrison in Ramzak in 1923. This move would prove to be something of a strategic blunder, as the garrison was an easy target for attacks. In the 1930s, there was more unrest and violence, as Mizali Khan, a member of the Wazir tribe and also known under the title of Fakir of Ipi, declared jihad against the British. The tribesmen rallied around Khan and started a guerrilla war against British colonial troops, where many on both sides lost their lives. In the 1940s, violence was still common, but had reduced a lot in conjunction with Britain reducing the size of the garrison at Ramzak. Khan would harass the British until they left British India in 1947. In 1947, Khan, alongside his allies straddling the Durand Line, declared the Banu Resolution. The resolution demanded that the Pashtuns be given a choice to have an independent state of Pashtunistan composing all Pashtun majority territories of British India. Instead, the Pashtuns were given the choice to join Pakistan during its process of becoming an independent nation, or India, which wasn't majority Muslim. Khan and his allies were ultimately ignored, and all of Waziristan, as well as all the other British Indian Pashtun territories, joined the newly formed nation of Pakistan without an option to join Afghanistan or to create Pashtunistan. Khan refused to recognize Pakistan and launched a campaign against the new state, but it petered out by 1954 when his commander-in-chief Dil Khan Khattak surrendered to Pakistani authorities. Khan himself died of natural causes in 1960, never being captured or killed. Pakistan was now a nation, and the federally administered tribal areas, FATA, including modern Waziristan, was established for the tribes to live semi-autonomously but under Pakistani rule. The Pakistanis kept much of the British administrative infrastructure, including keeping both North and South Waziristan's provincial capitals where they were. However, not everybody was happy with the arrangement. As we mentioned, the Fakir of Ippi was one such actor who never approved of Pakistani rule. Despite Pakistan's foundation as a Muslim nation, Islamic fundamentalists living between Afghanistan and Waziristan have been trying to establish their own conservative brand of Islamic rule ever since. This displays the long-standing connection between Waziristan and Afghanistan, regardless of the Durand Line dividing them. So when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, hundreds of thousands of Afghanis crossed the border into Pakistan. This in turn caused a crisis within Pakistan, who were struggling to establish themselves on the world stage after fighting 2 wars with Big Brother India. Pakistan's border on the Afghanistan side was very porous, allowing many people through because of the hostile terrain, a theme that has continued into the modern day. The Pakistani government extended extensive support to the Afghan Mujahideen under President Zia-ul-Haq, which in turn allowed the United States to support Pakistan and the Mujahideen by proxy because they were resisting Soviet conquest in Afghanistan. The Pakistanis, in conjunction with the US, used extremism to attempt to destabilize Soviet Afghanistan in what was known as Operation Cyclone. During this time, Waziristan acted as a safe haven for foreign Mujahideen from Central Asia. It was common during the Soviet-Afghan War for foreign Islamic fundamentalists to use Waziristan as a launching pad for attacks into Afghanistan. This was likely due to a few factors. The establishments of the Central Asian Mujahideen in the FATA during the Soviet-Afghan War, the proximity of Afghanistan to Waziristan and the region being semi-autonomous meant that Islamabad did not have full control over the area and therefore had plausible deniability. As a result, Waziristan became something of a staging ground and a breeding ground for extremist Islamic ideas. The Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, otherwise known as the Pakistani arm of the Taliban, would go on to be founded in Waziristan in 2002. Now, we've gone through all that history at quite the pace there. To show you, the region of Waziristan is founded in fundamental Islamic rebellion and resistance against large powers. The people who live there make up a diverse group of warriors who are used to the harsh terrain and mountainous regions and are well-versed in guerrilla warfare. They are staunchly supportive of their Pashtun brothers in Afghanistan and are willing to take up arms to defend their faith. So when the USA invaded Afghanistan in 2001, what did they think was going to happen? On September the 11th, 2001, 2 planes struck the World Trade Center towers in New York City, killing 3,000 people. The majority of the hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, but Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda were deemed to be the ultimate cause by US lawmakers, as the hijackers were members of the terrorist organization. In the same year, the US invaded Afghanistan, beginning what became known as the War on Terror. In a cruel twist of fate, the Pakistani and US-backed Islamic fundamentalists that fought the Soviets, including the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks, Osama bin Laden, had turned their jihad back on them. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. In 2004, the US had pushed the fundamentalists into the mountains in the eastern side of the country whilst hunting Al-Qaeda leaders. In particular, the fighting was taking place in the Tora Bora Caves, also known as the Black Caves. This was during the final stages of the US's planned portion of the invasion. Of course, we all know that the US went on to stay in Afghanistan for over 2 decades. During this time, the US was also putting pressure on Pakistan to do something about the fundamentalists in their country, given the prevalence of extremists using Waziristan as a staging ground or a place to escape to. Under this pressure in 2004, the Pakistani army entered the Khyber district just south of Waziristan for the first time since Pakistan's independence in 1947, later pushing into both southern and northern Waziristan itself. However, this presented a difficult situation for Pakistan, as many people in the tribal areas are Pashtun, so they are staunchly Islamic, and many of them disagreed with the USA's invasion of Afghanistan. By extension, many more were unhappy with the Pakistani army entering their semi-autonomous territory in support of a US initiative. They saw it as a stab in the back of their Pashtun brothers. Other areas in Pakistan had seen protests also, accusing the United States of imperialism and Pakistan of being its lackey. General DeLong, the second in command during the US invasion of Afghanistan, stated in his memoir that, quote, "To make matters worse, this tribal area was sympathetic to bin Laden." While DeLong initially said this in relation to the Tora Bora and attempted capture of bin Laden in 2001, some Waziristanis would have inexplicably felt the same in 2004. That does not mean that Muslims in Waziristan agreed on everything, though, and large-scale fighting between the tribal populations and foreign militant groups would break out from time to time. The Pakistani incursion into Waziristan erupted into conflict in the White Mountains of South Waziristan on the 16th of March 2004. The White Mountains are closely associated with the Black Caves of Afghanistan. The town of Wana sits in this area and is where the majority of the fighting took place, with reports of at least 500 al-Qaeda fighters holed up in the region at the time. It was also reported that foreign elements, including Tajiks, Chechens, and Uzbeks, were there. Now, we don't say this to point fingers and blame any one specific people for the fighting, but we want to show how much of a hotbed for foreign Islamic militancy Waziristan had become in the wake of the War on Terror. After the battle, man-made tunnels in Waziristan that led back to Afghanistan were found, showing how militants would use them to transit between both countries. This too would become a theme of stateless actors in the region. Foreign militants were so comfortable holding Waziristan as a staging ground, it was even later discovered that Tahir Yoldashev, the leader of the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, or IMU, was present in Waziristan at the time. On the 28th of March 2004, he was wounded in an attack by the Pakistani army before escaping, likely in one of the many tunnels. Despite conflicting reports of whether Yoldashev survived the attack, he would later be confirmed as deceased as a result of a US airstrike in South Waziristan in 2009. The IMU is a terrorist organization that was known for the numerous attacks it had claimed throughout Central Asia before later finding home in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And just to make it clear whose side these guys are on, they later pledged allegiance to ISIS. However, these were not the only terrorists in Waziristan, as the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and the Haqqani network, among other less well-known fundamentalist groups, would all find home in Waziristan at times throughout the 21st century. The US was watching the fighting closely. The Project on Government Oversight, an American nonpartisan national security watchdog, stated in its Center for Defense Information in 2004 that after intense fighting, 55 al-Qaeda fighters were killed alongside 49 of the Pakistani army, plus purportedly an unconfirmed large number of al-Qaeda members captured. This kicked off the unofficial conflict known as Pakistan's War on Terror. The fighting was intense across the whole western side of Pakistan. Over the coming years, 3 districts in the federal tribal areas were captured by militants and were under their de facto control, that being the Bajar district, South Waziristan, and North Waziristan. In 2005, Pakistan was able to arrest several high-profile al-Qaeda members, including Abu Faraj al-Libi, who was a top general for al-Qaeda at the time. However, the capture of high-profile militants did little to quell the violence. Several ceasefire agreements were made in 2006 and 2007 between the Pakistani government and tribal leaders, known as the Waziristan Accords. However, it was a hollow peace, and the violence continued, often motivated by US and Pakistani military involvement in the area. Throughout this time, attacks, raids, and suicide bombings were still relatively frequent. In Waziristan itself, there was a collapse into infighting. According to the BBC, by April of 2007, the local tribal population had successfully pushed the foreign militants, mostly Uzbeks, out of the valleys surrounding Wana. This resulted in the defeat of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan and the tribes regaining some control over the landscape. However, the IMU were not the only ones operating in Waziristan at the time. As we mentioned, Al-Qaeda were already present in the area, and 2007 was when the Pakistani arm of the Taliban, the TTP, began to rise in prominence, already by this time in control of many parts of Waziristan. For Waziristan, this would not be the end of militants in their lands or the bloodshed that the region had become almost synonymous with. Fighting was bound to erupt again. Waziristan was a powder keg, and all it needed was a spark. That spark came in July of 2007. In the city of Islamabad, over 300 kilometers away from Waziristan, what started out as clashes between militant student supporters and police at the Lal Masjid Mosque led to it being sieged by police and armed forces. Despite the Muslim League's attempts to quell the violence, it fell on deaf ears, with the siege lasting for 8 days, only being lifted to assault the mosque. Over 100 people were confirmed killed in the attack, but others have reported it as being a much higher death toll. Pakistan's Interior Secretary Syed Kamal Shah told reporters that, quote, "It is believed that some women and children holed up in the mosque lost their lives in the military operation against militants." However, no official numbers for the amount of innocent people killed was ever released. The Siege of the Red Mosque, as it is known, sent the shallow truce of militants in Waziristan into a tailspin. Even during the 8-day siege itself, there were several attacks in Waziristan as retaliation. That's not all, though. This was something of a watershed moment for Pakistan. It represented the catalyst that would cause widespread violence in northwest Pakistan to once again break out. This move that killed innocent Muslims among militants in a mosque was simply the straw that broke the camel's back, and this formally put an end to any peace agreements between Pakistan and its fundamentalists. The Waziristan Accords were dead. It was open season. Under pressure, Pakistani President General Pervez Musharraf moved a large swath of the Pakistani army into Waziristan, totally abandoning all principles of their semi-autonomous governance in the name of law and order. Fierce clashes with militants began. There were so many attacks by militants in Waziristan that it would be impossible to cover them all in this video. One of the most famous attacks covered by the Long War Journal was an incident where the TTP successfully captured over 100 security forces personnel after intercepting a military convoy in August of 2007. 300 people had been killed by attacks, mostly suicide bombings, by October. Between the tribal militants and their tensions with the foreign militants, the Pakistani security forces entered the region, and with the occasional airstrike from the USA, it was bedlam. However, the militants were able to take advantage of the chaos. In January of 2008, militants had overrun a Pakistani fort, one of many which scattered the landscape in Waziristan. Nevertheless, this goes to show how much of a fighting force the militants in Waziristan were at this time. They were strong, they had numbers, weapons, connections, escape routes, logistics, and most importantly of all for them, faith. The TTP had almost total control of both North and South Waziristan by 2008. The Pakistani army, now under new management since President Musharraf's resignation in 2008, began the painstaking process of clearing, holding, and building on the bordering areas of Waziristan to regain control. The army used this staging time as preparation for a major military offensive into South Waziristan known as Ra-e-Nijat, which arrived in October of 2009. This was the first time since the conflicts began that the Pakistani army truly had the numbers advantage over the smaller pockets of militants, as they sent 28,000 troops into South Waziristan from 3 directions. The Pakistani army was able to take back several towns and installations within South Waziristan, including the fort they had lost the year prior. However, with an estimated 10,000 militants in